to today was the idea of, okay, could there be a single moment, something that sets your synapses firing, it's lightning in a bottle, it's eureka, and you're kind of looking for a story. And I'm talking about nonfiction now, although I think the same is true in fiction as well, where the light bulbs all go off, and all of a sudden it's like, aha! So much of I think often the best nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, is scene-by-scene storytelling. So that single moment can be really important. I think it's often overlooked. And one of the goals today is that everyone here, aside from enjoying your lunch, you'll walk away thinking that narrative short forms, are the most vital and rewarding form of work, or one of them. How's that? Without talking further, if someone wants to start, and the goal here is to have our panelists talk to each other more than me. I think that's the best way to use our time here. So maybe, who wants to start this? Did that ever happen to you? Did you have that eureka moment, that single moment? Someone? Sam? Julie?
I'll start with a shout out to Alto Magazine, which is a gem. We're very lucky in California to have this magazine, and Blaze is the editor, of course. And an aha moment for me, I had the very good fortune to go to the Arctic Circle on a boat a few years ago. And I wanted to write about it, and I kept morning pages, which is something I do every single day. And that morning, I wrote about one morning towards the end of the trip. I wrote about a kind of a aha moment of being in a Zodiac with a small group, including armed guards, and the guide saying to us, this very intense Dutch woman with red hair, and she said, "Stop talking." We all stopped talking, and way over on the snow was a very athletic polar bear moving very fast. And that was the lead for the piece we did.
Yeah.
And we had some incredible photographs, didn't we, for that? But sometimes, kind of like an architect sees something. I'm sure all of us as writers, we feel like that's a perfect moment to try to recapture that scene and how it felt to us.
And I remember that was a great story. And Julie's written several amazing pieces for us, and please go find them. The murder of Jane Stanford, the safe house that became unsafe, that sort of came out of your reporting in Chinatown about the Cameron House and things that are happening there. But why I think that what you're suggesting might work is, how did you take that single moment, though, and turn it into a bigger idea?
There was such a wonderful segue, because I was trying to write kind of an abstract piece about the relationship between California and the Arctic, and what was happening with the warming of the Arctic, and what was happening with the turbulent weather we were having. We had an oceanic a river, or whatever they call it, that year, so we had these torrential rains. And so the segue was a very simple one, which was I set up that scene, and then the next moment was talking about dreaming about that polar bear when I was back in California, and the rains are coming down, and we're getting these warnings from the National Weather Service. So that's how that came up, I think.
Yeah. I remember. I think it was called the butterfly effect. Yeah, and this idea that I remember internally we're talking about the story, and people say, "Wait, Julie went to the Arctic? What does that have to do with California?" And I said, "Well, it does, because what happens there affects us here."
I'm going to try not to be myself and knock over the flowers by mistake. That's so within my skill set. You have to know. I want to back up and do something a little bit different, which is to say that even though I work in nonfiction and think a lot in scenes, I think one reason I do is that my dirty little secret is that as a nonfiction narrative writer, my influences are overwhelmingly fiction, theater, and film, not nonfiction. And what I've learned from those forms is the importance of everything being made visual. And in my own writing, whether it's unless it's like an opinion piece on an op-ed piece about a political issue or something like that, but whether I'm working at shorter length, like the piece I read last night, or at book length, unless I'm deliberately moving into a contextual chapter or a contextual passage that's set apart by asterisks or, a line break from everything else, I try to work in terms of what I call pure narrative. And when I'm writing pure narrative, to me, it all has to be visual, and it has to go from scene to scene to scene. And so it's not just a matter of having that one scene. I think one thing I learned when I began to move from newspaper writing into longer form is that with newspapers, the form in a lot of even the best feature writers is you put a lot of toil into the opening anecdote, and in a long form piece that might be a couple of hundred words. But after that, as a former colleague of mine on the New York Times used to say self-mockingly, after the lead, it's all landfill. By which he meant that we'd put so much labor and lapidary care into an opening anecdote and not do the same thing sequentially as the piece went on. And in writing books, or even, again, at article length, pure narrative, or even when the narrative is interspersed with context, what's vital to me is to be able to go scene to scene to scene. So it's not just one, it's being able to string them together in the way that a screenwriter, it behooves a screenwriter to go from one visualization to another to another. It behooves a theater director to take the playwright's words and then give them a form on a stage. That's different from doing a table read, right? You have to give it physical action in a physical space. And I think when you think about going from scene to scene, you instantly have an inventory in your head of what don't I have yet? Who else do I need to talk to? What else do I need to read? What else do I need to see? And I don't want to go on and on about this, but one other thing I'll just say about my work model is that not only do I outline very, very assiduously, so I can go from scene to scene, and that's sort of the craft part of me, but there is a mystical element of what we do. And even though I'm like the least sort of mystical person you'll probably ever meet, one thing I believe in is when I'm writing a book, whatever part of the book I'm in, I always have a corkboard, a gigantic corkboard in my writing room, wherever that happens to be, and I put up period photos. Maybe they're photos of the people I'm writing about, maybe it's photos of the physical places or the landscape, and partly so I can consult the photos easily and figure out how do I describe what that storefront looks like or whatever it is. Or, gee, I better check what kind of tree that is because I'm from, the strip malls and chemical plants of New Jersey, so like flora and fauna, not my strong suit. But it's also because I feel like there is this mystical conversation that in fact is happening between these visual artifacts and what I'm writing. And if I spend a month on a chapter, which would be kind of the norm, being in the presence of the physical stuff every day somehow permeates what I'm doing.
Yeah, I can tell you want to say something.
Yes. I hear in both of my colleagues' offerings on this question, I hear something, a lesson that I've sort of learned over the years about my own writing of short nonfiction, which can be many, many different things. But I think I've been very fortunate. I spent half my life, my professional writing life, writing fiction, and the other half writing nonfiction, almost equal, more than 30 years of doing both back and forth. And I think that that short literary nonfiction works when you build it around a literary element, a single literary element usually, right? And so you think of the elements of what makes writing literature: voice, mastery of scene, character, setting. And so usually a piece for me of short nonfiction will begin with a kind of extended moment of staying inside one of those elements. So for example, circa 2001, I got a call from the New Yorker which was like hearing the voice of God, right? And yeah, yeah. And so they were writing. They were dedicating an issue to the way the United States looked to people from abroad. And even though I'm U.S. born and raised, I am Guatemalan, which is very foreign sounding, very exotic. So they asked me if I would write a short piece for them, kind of like a what is it called again? They call them the personal history, 900 words or so, of just like America from the perspective of a foreigner. And so I latched on to this one thing, which was my Guatemalan father, born in a Guatemalan village of about 5,000 people, which he describes, and I've been to it, and it is kind of like a village out of a Garcia Marquez novel, who comes to LA in the 1960s. And he latched on to this one book, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, as his guide to success in the United States. So this piece was about my father's absolute obsession with Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And, you know, if those of you don't know it, it's like a 1930s self-help book that basically gave your average Anglo-American a guide on how to, win friends and influence people. So it's like, remember people's names. Say hello to people when you walk in the room. Listen. Give praise, but be honest in giving the praise. I read this when I was 12 years old because my father insisted I read it. And I still remember it, you know, the little points, you know, one of them was like, yes, give praise, but it has to be sincere praise. It stayed with me my whole life. So I'm writing this, and I realized as I was thinking about this book that what Dale Carnegie was doing, this Midwestern salesman, I think he was a salesman, right? Yeah. What he was doing was he was teaching Americans, white Americans, how to be like Latinos. And that's why my father loved the book, because he saw the elements of himself that would triumph in America. So it was a single idea, and that kind of thing is, building that single idea and then being like a novelist, right? Because when you're a novelist, you take a character, you take a scene, and you just dive into it, right? As if a whole world were contained in that one scene or one idea or that one self-help book.
That's great. And I want to go back to Sam for a moment. So I'm trying to picture you somewhere with pictures of Hubert Humphrey on your walls, and is he talking to you at night? Is he having dreams about him? Like, what was there? Was there an aha moment? Like, what turned you on to him?
Oh, well, that's a whole longer answer. I'll answer that very briefly, and then I'll talk about what photos were on.
Yeah.
My last book, Into the Bright Sunshine, is about Hubert Humphrey's early political career and basically the civil rights battles in this country of the 1940s. And the quick answer is I wasn't looking for a book about Hubert Humphrey. For the last 25 years or so, in some part of my brain, I was looking for a book about America right after the end of World War II and the taking stock that was going to happen of now that we were the superpower along with the USSR, but without the damage to the homeland that the Soviet Union suffered. What were we going to do with that power, and what were we going to do about our own moral imperfections as a nation? And I'd never found the right way to do the book. And then just through a comment that a friend of mine, the historian Julian Zelzer, made at a book talk my wife and I went to, and he mentioned in passing Hubert Humphrey's great civil rights speech at the 1948 Democratic Convention, which I knew about, but something about when Julian said it, everything exploded for me. And I just knew, now I have scene, now I have drama, now I have a central character. And then I did end up caring a lot about Humphrey in the course of writing about him, which was great. But the kind of things I would put up on the board were more in writing about the Dakotas when he was growing up there. And again, being this New Jersey guy, writing about the wheatlands is not something that comes naturally to me. And I'm not naturally a great landscape writer. I have to make sure I work really hard at it. But so having photos of small towns and his hometown and what wheat fields looked like, what storm clouds over the horizon looked like. And then when I would be writing about the Democratic Convention itself in 1948, photos of A. Philip Randolph leading the protesters, photos of the Southern segregationists, the so-called Dixiecrats, walking out, photos of signs related to the convention around the city of Philadelphia where the convention was held. So it's whatever I think might talk to me and will mean that I can't ever avert my eye from the moment in time that I'm populating, that I'm going to be visually reminded this is where I am for those hours. I was writing most of the book in Minneapolis, some in New York, but Minneapolis or New York in 2022 does not exist. When I'm in this room, I'm in Dolan, South Dakota in 1922 as the wheat prices are falling, or I'm in Baton Rouge with young Hubert Humphrey looking at the Jim Crow system, or I'm looking at A. Philip Randolph leading the marchers and threatening draft resistance by young black men if Harry Truman doesn't desegregate the military. I want to be locked in on that stuff. And it's often visual for me, but sometimes it's other things. When I was writing the book Who She Was, about my mother's life as a young woman, her coming of age, basically age 13 to about age 28, from starting high school to marrying my father, which was her second marriage. And I wrote it because I was totally incurious about her as a teenager, and she died when I was a teenager. It was really important to me to watch the movies that I found out that she liked, these Nelson Eddy movies, which, believe me, otherwise I would not have been much interested in watching. It was really important to listen to the music of that time when she was juggling two different boyfriends who were both fighting World War II, but to listen to the song that Sinatra did, Saturday Night is the Loneliest Night of the Week, which is about being a woman on the home front, and it's date night, and your fella is somewhere overseas and you don't know if he's ever coming back. So immersing myself in the soundtrack and the films of that time, as well as photos, was hugely important.
Wow. And does anyone else have a similar?
Yeah, I was doing a profile of the poet Javier Zamora. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him. He's an absolutely incredible writer. Solito was his breakout first book. He was a poet, a beautiful poet, is a beautiful poet. And I was writing for an alumni magazine, and he had a photograph that he shared with me. I interviewed his mother as well. Maybe it was his mother who shared it with me. And there's a relatively short piece, like 2,000, 3,000 word profile. And it was a profile of Javier when he was 9 years old. And he first stepped onto an elite prep school campus. And this is a guy who 5 months earlier, a child who 5 months earlier had walked by himself from Honduras to the United States, and went on to write a harrowing story about that. So in that case, the photograph was both inspiration, but it also was extremely helpful in terms of reporting, because I could use that as a prompt with his mother. English was not her first language, and we could talk about when she first saw Javier, what did he look like when he first rang the doorbell, and another use of photographs.
I remember I had a time for a few years where I wrote regular op-eds for the New York Times, which was its own sort of challenge, and that 900-word form, or 850 or whatever it is. And it really taught me a lot, and it helped me when I wrote my book, Our Migrant Souls. I sort of learned a lot from it. But one thing was I wanted to write something about cartel movies and how infuriated I was with the emergence of this genre, which is like now the dominant form in which Latino people are represented in film and television, right? And so I spent 2 weeks watching cartel movies. And I watched Jennifer Garner's Odious Peppermint, which is this movie that about a suburban mom who gets caught up in this cartel drama that climaxes with her in a gun battle in a piñata factory. And so nobody's seen it, but every time I see a Capital One card, I just get so angry. I see those ads for her in the Capital One, Jennifer Garner in the swimming pool. It just makes me so upset. And I watched the very good movie, The Mule, Clint Eastwood's The Mule.
Yeah. Yes.
And I watched poor Gina Rodriguez, a great actress who did this, starred in a cartel movie that was like Miss Bala. It was a remake of a Mexican movie called Miss Bala, which means Miss Bullet, about a beauty contestant who gets wrapped up into a cartel drama. And so all that watching, you just have to kind of look for some really strong, powerful central ideas. And one of them was, and also I had seen forever Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad I had seen backward and forward because my kids loved it. My Latino kids loved it. So I had seen all of Breaking Bad and also Better Call Saul. But anyways,
Yeah.
so the two ideas were that, well, number one, what messages are these movies sending? What ideological messages are these movies sending about Latino people? That they're dangerous, right? That they are this. And I said that I thought about it more. I thought about film history. And I said that Latino people, we are essentially equivalent in these movies to the, Indians on a rampage. Forgive that ethnic slur. The natives on the rampage in the old Westerns, right? So you have these people who are the homesteaders, usually now like a white person who's become déclassé, who's had a crisis, like Walter White in Breaking Bad. And so the cartel, the native people, they are like this dangerous force, and that of course dovetails perfectly with the ideology of the MAGA movement, right? Of the immigrant as this dangerous, barbaric force, and you can say that in a few paragraphs, and I did. And the other one was that that essentially these movies are allegories for white powerlessness. So the cartel, the people who are writing these screenplays don't really know anything about cartels. They don't know they know very little about Latino culture. But they do know a lot about what it's like to work for a studio. And they do know a lot of like what it's like to be at a really bad, job where you've got a terrible boss. So if you look at these movies, the cartels are really, they're stand-ins for the bad boss that you have, right? The corporation that rules your life, the private equity firm that owns your building, okay? Mm-hmm. And so that the emotional center of those movies is in that relationship. So really, a bunch of scenes, obviously Jennifer Garner fighting the piñatas, or Clint Eastwood. You only really need, like in fiction, you need just one or two really solid moments of specificity to sell the idea. So Clint Eastwood, in the movie The Mule, he's this elderly gentleman who has, he grows orchids, but he gets, he's gone on bad times. And he meets this really nice Latino neighbor who invites him to join a friend of his to be a mule for the cartel. And he gets deeper and deeper into it. And of course, there's the obligatory scene where he goes to Mexico and he meets the cartel boss, in this case, Andy Garcia. And almost every one of these movies has a swimming pool with Latino women in bikinis on the side, right? Drinking shots of tequila. But then in the climax of the movie, these really bad cartel guys, he's in the middle of a delivery, and they tell him and they show him a trunk. They open the trunk of a car and there's a body in it. And the message is, they tell him explicitly, "We own your ass," right? Which is the same thing that your corporate boss is basically telling you. So that one line of dialogue really sort of sold the idea, that one image of Jennifer Garner. So it's basically finding this sort of point that you want to make and finding some very simple, having a really powerful insight that you feel is original, and then selling it with some literary moments. Yeah.
Well, and having read his great Our Migrant Souls, it's about your voice, Hector. So you're bringing it together. In fact, when I think about those columns and the essays that you wrote in the book, it's your voice that's elevating all of that.
Well, thank you. And that voice was taught to me by James Baldwin, among others, by so many great essayists that I read. Yeah, definitely. Voice is very important. And, and voice, too, is a literary tradition. It's you learning from the people that you've read.
Yeah. Go ahead, Julie. I'm sorry. Okay, so I wanted to, go back to something that Sam was talking about, and also to give a big recommendation to Javier Zamora's book, Solido, the first volume of poetry, Unaccompanied, that preceded that, and you can watch an interview with him on altonline.com. He was one of our California Book Club authors, as was Hector. So it's all there. It's, 6 years worth. Yeah. Okay, and then, but anyway, so back to what Sam was saying. Because Sam was talking about sort of scene by scene, like really doing scene by scene storytelling, which suggests more of a feature length, 3,000, 5,000 words, something like that at least. And to throw some shade at the New Yorker for a moment, the landfill part. I mean, we've all read it, right? And every magazine does it too. Right? There's great opening, grabs you, great opening lead, anecdote, pantomimic action, revealing something. Great, I'm loving this. And then the section break and so-and-so was born in 1956 in Indiana. His parents were, and you get that. And it's just like dead. And that would never fly in Hollywood, right? And so how do we get away from that and towards what you're describing, Sam?
I think the thing is that you do the research and you map it out. I'm sorry. You do the research, and then if you're me, you map it out. Or you do the research, and if you prefer to try a really raw draft, what Ann Fadiman calls a vomit draft, then you spill it out and then see what you have, and then figure out how do I go back in and build it from scene to scene. But one way or another, before the kind of the final round of composing, you have to have a sense of where you're going and how you're progressing from scene to scene. And a couple of other things I'd say to keep in mind are that we all get to be very Faulknerian when we're writing scene, that in IRL, a second is a second, a minute is a minute, an hour is an hour. When you're writing scenes, you can expand or contract time as needed. You can skip over a decade in a paragraph, or you can spend 500 words on something that took 15 seconds to transpire, and that's a way of telling the reader, this is so important, I want you to dwell here for a while. A good friend of mine, a fellow writer and writing teacher named Kevin Coyne, teaches this great lesson about Bruce Springsteen's song Thunder Road as a work of narrative, and how that entire song, all the narrative action, takes place in a moment when a car pulls up to this girl's house and she is deciding whether to get in the car with the guy who's driving it.
Mary.
Yeah, Mary.
Not too bad looking.
Right? And that's all right with me. And all the action, a lot of which takes place in the head, which is the other thing to keep in mind, that narrative action and scene isn't just outwardly expressed, it's also all the gears turning in here. And I could very happily write about nothing but motivation for my entire writing life, because it's so fascinating to me. But in that song, it's a great example of, there's a little bit of physical action and there's a great deal of interior action, and this whole bigger canvas is evoked by what's actually a limited moment in time with very little physical action with one setting. And Springsteen writes a lot of other songs that have a very different sense of physical movement, the time span, but this is a good one, I think, for us as writers to know that there's great narrative possibility and great drama, even what on first glance, on first consideration might seem static, but in fact is not.
I think in answer to your question, how to avoid that kind of sense, the deadening of a narrative, I think that my goal is to keep the reader engaged and also off balance. Like, what is this maniac going to do next? Right? That's kind of like what I'm trying to achieve. It's like, wow, this is an amazing story. This guy's, what is he going to do next? And so, and the problem is that usually that kind of dead zone comes from not really knowing what you're writing about. I think that for me is what the problem is. You don't really know what you're talking about, and so because stereotype is what you write when you imagine you need a subject and you don't really know that person, right? So I'm going to write something. Oh, I have a Cambodian character here, let's say, for example, okay? Well, actually, I've been to Cambodia. Let's say a Laotian, character. And I've never been to Laos. I'm going to imagine what it must be like to be, and so the first thing I'm going to fill in my head are just kind of a stereotype. If I know nothing, poor, simple, rustic, and so I'm going to give that character these qualities that are reflections of my own ignorance. So the way to overcome that, and this is what the reporter taught me, nonfiction, was go out and investigate and research a little bit, right? Go out and question the moment. Question what you take for granted, right? I take for granted that a woman would react in this situation in a certain way. Would she necessarily react that way? And if she does react that way, how might it be different? I remember I wrote a novel, The Barbarian Nurseries, and I wanted to make my character, it was an Alta Book Club book, yeah. And I wanted to make my character tall. She's a tall woman. Well, I'm neither tall nor a woman. So I was living in Mexico City, and I knew some tall women. I said, what is it like to be a tall Mexicana? And I don't remember what they told me, but it helped me feel a little bit more confident in the fact that I was onto something with this character. So sometimes doing a little bit of research, because what research does is it presents to you real life. Real life is always going to surprise you. I learned this, you can see a group of people and you could go to a writing conference, and this has happened to everybody here this week. And I've never been to a writing conference before, and all the students are going to be everyone's going to have written a lot of stuff already, and they're all going to have they'll have people with English degrees, or they'll all be able to quote their favorite scene from Ulysses or something, And then you get to the writing conference and you find that everyone loves books, but they all love different books, and they all have different experiences. And everyone surprises you in a certain way. And so our job as writers, even in the short form of nonfiction, is to capture that sense of surprise.
Could I follow up on that?
Sorry, can I just throw in one thing along your point about how research will surprise you? Oh, and I'm sorry, my phone is ringing.
You surprised me with that. Yeah.
Let me put it away. Sorry about that. So my first newspaper job was in Central Jersey, near where I grew up, near the small city of Plainfield, which is where Parliament Funkadelic is from. And one summer I got a call on the job because one of the young stars of Parliament Funkadelic, a guy named Glenn Goins, had just died of leukemia, and all of the musicians around were going to play all night at this bar in Glenn's memory. So I went there to cover it and interviewed people. It was a whole amazing experience in my writing life and my music life. And one of the people I talked to was one of P-Funk's longtime bass players, Billy Nelson, who everyone calls Billy Bass. And I was asking him about his influences. And a lot of the influences people were talking about tonight were what you would expect. Gospel music coming out of the churches, and, early soul music and some of the psychedelia that George Clinton liked. And Billy Bass tells me he was really into Jethro Tull, which was like head-banging white boys in my Wisconsin dorm music. So you just don't know till you ask.
And I find over the last few years, I grew up in the same ecosystem of old-fashioned journalism. So I reported for most of the big newspapers, basically, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, other places. And I've been experimenting over the last few years of interjecting myself and using first person and using humor. And using myself as a character, and that has the wonderful purpose of changing the tempo, changing the feel, throwing the reader off balance a little bit. I mean, one example that comes to mind is a kind of silly piece I wrote for the Wall Street Journal last summer, which was about following in Jane Austen's footsteps, and it was a really tough hike. And I was about to die at the end. I mean, I had unbelievable blisters. I honestly don't think I could have done it. And it was so much fun to make fun of myself over that and to, riff on Jane Austen. And so in terms of just plain old tempo and just, throwing the reader off balance, and also kept me really interested in writing it. It was more fun to write it that way. So I don't know. I just wanted to throw in that idea, the hybridization, the throwing in the first person.
Well, yeah, and that is kind of, it's really hard to write with a level of, when you're writing about real people and you're going to put them in print, it's very hard to be completely honest about them, right? But you can be honest about yourself. And so that allowed you to interject this vulnerability to the piece, right? Which is something that fiction really works with. It works with vulnerability. And so, yes, very often I've done the same thing. I find it's like putting myself in a piece, and I tell this to my journalism students, it's like a really strong vitamin, a really strong drug. Use it in small doses, or else it can just totally overwhelm the piece. But it is so useful, absolutely.
I think the other key thing with first person, though, is to understand you're writing about yourself as a character. Yes. And that you're not just using the first person pronoun. I'm talking about in nonfiction as a convenience. Yes. And I know a lot of the people who are here for nonfiction are working on either memoirs or family histories or types of nonfiction where they will be a character. And what you have to do, I always have the image of Hamlet holding Yorick's skull at arm's length, is you have to be looking at your past self. And you have to actually report on your past self. You can't write about who you are now. You have to conjure up who you were then. And most of the book about my mother is set from 1938 to 1953, but there is a substantial part that's set in 1974, the last months when she was alive, and when I was 18. And I had to really report on myself. Fortunately, I save all the letters I ever get. I reread every letter anyone had sent to me that year at college and that summer at home, the Death Watch summer. My sister and some of my friends had the letters I had written to them. I read those letters. I went through the snapshot albums of our family and forced myself to look at my unbearably dorky self. I listened to the music. I double-checked. I fact-checked myself. I thought I had always remembered getting home for the start of the summer on the day when the Symbionese Liberation Army tried to rip off the sporting goods store in South Central, and then the SWAT team burned the house they were in. Yeah. And I knew I wanted to build to a line about that Death Watch summer based on watching that on TV the first day I was home for the summer and thinking to myself something I'd never forgot, which was, I know the feeling of a burning house. And I had to double check and make sure it all timed out correctly, but also situate myself as the, unbearably dorky kid I was. And also earlier in the book, as this horribly cold son who could do the thing that always, scourged me, which is when my mother, well into the cancer that would kill her, came to visit me my freshman year of college and wanted to go to my favorite class with me, this fantastic comp lit class. And typical of a first semester class at UW-Madison, there are a couple of hundred people in it, but I still said, you cannot sit next to me. You have to sit somewhere else in the lecture hall, and I'm going to tell you where I'm going to walk down University Ave after class, and you can't acknowledge me until I'm a couple of blocks away, which made me feel for decades unworthy to mourn her. So you have to report on yourself. And as Hector said, you have to be unbleeping relenting on yourself, especially if you're going to be sitting in judgment the way authors have to, compassionate judgment, but judgment nonetheless of other people. You better not make yourself the hero of this tale.
And you used a great word. You said conjuring this world. And conjuring implies magic, right? The magic of illusion, and then you described how you created the magic, which was through hard work, right? Through precision. And so, so nonfiction in long form, short form, can conjure the real world. We have a pact with the reader that it's all true, so we have to rely on our work to sort of make sure it's right, to see what's there that we might not have seen, that might not be in our memory. Oh, another thing we can do, and I tell my students, I have this term, my students love this, is do memory work, which is where you live with the memory, you carry it around with you for a week, and when you do that, moments of time that you're relaxing, the memory will grow. Memory has that, because that's the way memory works in our brain. So, you're going to write about your mother. You write a scene about her. It becomes like a snowball. It gets bigger. An hour later, you're doing the dishes or you're driving your daughter to school, and another image from that moment comes to you. So that kind of memory work can be really valuable too.
Yeah. And Julie brought up the point. I mean, I'll just back up for a second. When we're talking about short form, when Kelly McMasters was reading the other night, she had these little snippets she called them still lifes. I mean, those were nonfiction short forms. I mean, they can be very short too. But, sometimes thinking that inserting yourself as a character is a very powerful tool. I had a story that Joy Lanzendorfer, a very talented journalist, wrote. Yeah. And it was about a childhood friend who went missing. And it's sort of a really sad story, and she went and kind of just tracked down this tragic life of a classmate who she hadn't seen since grade school to understand what could have happened, what had gone wrong. She died early, young, and she wrote the terrific draft, and it was depressing as hell. I mean, it was really a sad story. But I thought to myself, why is this so special? It's not. It's just another. To be totally crass and blunt, these stories, people die all the time, right? And so I said, well, Joy, how do we, what attracted you to this? And she started telling me how it was the era of the milk cartons when missing children were first being put on milk cartons, how her parents were so afraid for her, and that she had this fear, and then it has stayed with her whole life. And I said, well, please put that in there. And she did, and it just changed the story completely. All of a sudden, now it had real momentum, and there was these personal insights and a double whammy of emotional resonance for our readers.
Can I add? I'm obsessed with this book, and I feel like I need to reread it and reverse engineer it again. It's called Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. Has anybody read this book? One person's read it. It is the most bizarre book ever. It's by a long dead first president of Stanford University who was a villain. He was an early eugenicist. He probably was involved, certainly was involved in the cover-up of the death of Jane Stanford, but may have
Julie
killed
wrote
him,
about.
which I wrote about. So that's how I knew about the book a little bit. But the crazy thing that Lulu Miller, who is a radio person, did was she wove in her personal story, which was all about coming out to her father. And, it's like, what? And she did it so brilliantly. It was a crazy book. And I can't get over that book for some reason. So, again, it's just like your story about Joy. It's like, why are we drawn to certain stories? Why was Lulu drawn to that story? And
yeah, and it's that curiosity that we're actually discussing here today. And so, we've talked about photos and music, and are there other talismans? I mean, there's the Harry Ransom Center at UT, there's the New York Public Library, there's Bancroft Library, research. And what role does research play in crafting single moments?
Well, this is where I had to learn to stop being a journalist and do what historians do and learn it firsthand, which is to work with primary sources. So my first two books were immersion reporting books. I embedded once in a school, once with an African-American church, and did some secondary source work. But then after that, I began to move increasingly into learning by doing how to do history and understanding just the amazing experience of sitting there, like with the most recent book, with the Humphrey book, reading the love letters that Hubert Humphrey and his girlfriend Muriel Buck, later to become his wife, are writing back and forth, and him pouring out his ambitions and her urging him on in those and saying, you've got to break away from your domineering father to have that future you want. And there's something about touching the physical stuff, or even looking at a public speech, like his convention speech, at the original document and seeing, here's where he crossed stuff out, here's where he made edits, and understanding that that's part of the story that you're going to be able to tell. So that, I've become such a convert to working with the physical artifacts of all kinds, and letting them tell a lot of the story to me and then through me.
I'm a real big believer in the interview. Partly as my experience of having been a journalist. Is this working? Not really. Can I use yours? Sorry, I think they turned mine down because I was talking so loud. So I'll try to speak in a regular voice on this one. Yeah, I'm a big believer in the interview, and of course the archive. The archive is amazing because the interview is a kind of engagement with somebody. I think that when a lot of people think of interviews, they think of like a mining process where you're extracting something from somebody. But for me, the interview is more of a kind of like relationship that you have with somebody over the course of 30 minutes, or maybe you interview them a lot, over a course of a week. I ask my students to do interviews. A lot of them end up speaking to their mothers and fathers for the first time about a certain moment. And there's always a surprise. People will always surprise you. The interview is just really, really great that way. Oh, and then to sort of think, and it's great to be a writer conducting an interview, because while you're standing there in front of this person and they're telling you a story, they're turning down my microphone again. It's important to think like a writer as you're conducting this interview. So the interview is a paradox, because you're you're asking people about something you don't know about and you can't know about. You want them to tell you the thing that they most need to tell you. And more than likely, you don't have any idea what it is. So your job the beginning of the interview is to make this person relax and trust you, and to communicate one thing: your curiosity and respect for them, right? And so when you get into that space, they start telling you something that's important to them that you didn't expect, and you realize suddenly that's the story. It's fallen from heaven. I did not know it was there. That's the story. Let's follow this thread. And then that's really where they want to go anyway. That's why they brought it up, right? Mm-hmm. And so that process can be such a wonderful one of discovery, even of someone you know intimately. I have found out stuff about my father because my kids, his grandchildren, interviewed him. Things that he never told me, even though I think I spent my whole lifetime listening to him, right? There were things that he told them. So yeah, interviewing to me is a great process in terms of just, it's almost like going out and testing the waters to see what's there.
Right. It's funny. It's working for me. I want to ask Julie something, and that is, so we worked on a story about, terrible story about, called clergy abuse. And so Julie had an opportunity to interview some people, also do a lot of historical research on the Cameron House in Chinatown. But then at the end, you go and confront the pastor.
Well, I mean, this is an example. Hector, you were talking about interviewing, but this is an example of re-interviewing and re-interviewing. So I had a heads up that there was a very serious pastoral abuse issue before I began the book, The White Devil's Daughters, which is about a group of women who came and helped vulnerable girls and women some of whom were trafficked. But I knew that the successor to the women who ran that home, particularly one successor, was a man who was a predatory priest, and he was abusing boys. And the woman who had the kind of key to the archives and to all the records said, you may not want to do the story at all because of the shadow of this predatory priest. And, I was hanging around that house for 5 years and got to know a lot of people. And that was a perfect example of kind of absorbing what was actually under the surface. And people just started, it wasn't a formal interview process at all at the beginning. People just started talking to me because all of a sudden I became part of the wallpaper. Like they knew who I was. Like, oh, I've seen her a bunch of times. And in fact, there was just a street named after one of the women who was involved in helping other women in San Francisco, Tien Fu Wu Wei. And the son, I didn't tell you this, Blaise, but the son of the predatory priest who I had interviewed for our story came up to me and said, I want to tell you more. I want to tell you more. So I guess what I mean to say is that sometimes the best way that I've found is not to do formal interviews. And again, I'm trained as a journalist, just like Hector and Sam here, but to just show up a lot, just to be there a lot. And people start talking to you once they start believing and trusting you. That happened in the wine country too. People couldn't stop talking to me once they knew. It's like, come on, I want to tell you all about this. So
Yeah, I mean, I had a recent experience, and there's a there's a story about this in the current issue of Alta Journal, about I learned I had a half brother, and so we decided we were going to do a story together, and I'd gotten to know him a little bit, and we talked, and everything was chummy because we're only 8 months apart, so on, and I said, okay, I was trying to figure out how to do the story, and so I couldn't. We did Zoom calls. It just didn't work. I couldn't get out of being the interviewer kind of thing. And it wasn't until like sort of spending 3 days with him, finally we'd met each other, and we did. And I said, "You ready to do the interview now?" And because I'd send him the transcript each time, he said, "This is bad. Let's not publish this." And eventually that took. It was kind of that trust. It was learning what to do and vulnerability. I mean, that's been mentioned, and that I think we both broke down in tears at various times and so on. But it was just that moment. It was like getting that close, and I think that's something that nonfiction often people talk about. I want to write about this, and I'm just too close to it, or I need distance. And I mean, just the best advice someone gave to me was, "You're not close enough." Get closer. You can never get too close because you got to tell the story from the inside out. All those tools have been mentioned: characters, plot, decorum, pantomime. That all applies. Nonfiction and fiction. It's the best fiction is the same as the best nonfiction. It will,
I think that's what you're talking about. Interviewing is the paradox and dialectic of writing, which is the paradox. It's that you immerse yourself in the world of your subject. You're loyal to them on the level of them, of your relationship with them. But then you step back and you're objective and you betray that trust, even if they're fictional characters.
Yeah.
And you tell the full truth. Now, it might be a truth. I mean, it has to be a truth. So it's this process of both being immersed and stepping back. That's what makes a writer.
Yeah. And I know someone recommended John Casey's Spartina the other night, and I'm friends with. I knew him and friends with his daughters, and they all write about each other. Like there's no holds barred. I mean, there's a family of writers, and they nothing's safe, nothing's sacred in terms of their books. So you can't. That's the beauty of fiction, and it's more true than anything else sometimes. But you know what? I think we're almost have just a few minutes left. So we have any questions from anybody? Would love to talk further. Yes, Monique.
Picking up on what you were just saying, once you get, if you're embedded with someone and spending so much time and getting so close, you're writing, and then they say, "Oh, please don't write about that." So I've experienced that a few times where it's like, but it's so good to write about that. Maybe it could just be an anecdote that they don't want you to share. But how do you gauge
Let me repeat the question. So the question is, when you learn of some really juicy, important information, and then the person tells you, "Please don't write about that." How do you address that?
I think you have to respect that. Definitely. I think what you can do is persuade them to maybe open up a little bit more, going back to them. You can also just, oftentimes that comes from a misunderstanding of what you're doing. Because you're not going to produce a complete record of the conversation, right? And so maybe giving a sense of how you see this information and why it's important. I know this is hard for you. Maybe we can change your name, or maybe we can do something else to convey that information. I have a passage of a novel that is a story someone told me, someone I know very well. And it's very revealing of that person. And even though it's fictional, and I don't feel like I need to check anything in fiction really. I approached this person. I said, I want you to read this, and I want you to be comfortable with this appearing in print in my novel because it's really about you, and I felt so much better. I felt like I was on solid ground. So having them understand exactly what it is you're doing can oftentimes maybe, assuage some of those concerns.
I think that's such great advice, Hector. And I would say, when I was younger, I was a little bit more ruthless. And that, why don't they know the rules of the game? This is all on the record. And I'm not like that, particularly the story, The Safe House That Was Not Safe. For Blaze, the most incredibly tender, horrible exploitation that had happened. And for the first time, I went through every single line with people who had been subject to that abuse to make sure they were comfortable. That's a very exceptional case, I think. But I'm a lot more careful, and I'm now than I was when I was younger.
I have one other thing like that, which is that I wrote another piece for the New Yorker in which I revealed that my father had affairs when I was younger. So the other one was really, he's alive. So I knew that at some point the notorious New Yorker fact checkers would run this by him. And to my surprise, he talked to the fact checker for an hour. And then he's like, I said, hey, did you talk to my father? He's like, oh yeah, no problem. It's all good. And so it was like he was admitting finally, but then I sent him the PDFs of the page proofs. And then he looked at it and he got so upset. Your mother was lying to you. And I said, Papa, how come you didn't tell that to the fact checker? Well, I would never tell that person anything that would hurt your peace,
Oh.
So
he took one for the team,
yeah.
right?
So anyways, yeah. So.
Oh, that's great. I think we have one more question. Yeah, over here, please. Look, the question is about fact checking and whether or not sometimes in fact checking the researcher might be putting themselves in danger, and is it ethical then to have somebody, in the case of say a white supremacist, a male white supremacist, I'm going to assume, or something, to have another white male do the interview in order to get more out of the subject.
I don't think that's much of a solution, because a white supremacist is going to size up in about 2 seconds that even another white male isn't the right kind of white male. And I think it's morally objectionable to put someone else in a vulnerable position that you yourself are not willing to go into when you're more experienced. It reminds me of this incredible piece that someone did for the New Yorker 4 or 5, 6 years ago about knucklehead drug users. It was in Tallahassee, Florida, who'd get busted on minor charges, and then the cops would flip them and say, we'll drop your charge if you'll become an informant infiltrating this bigger dealer. And this person ended up getting killed because the cops threw someone into a situation of treachery for which they had no preparation. And the same thing can happen journalistically. And if I'm not saying you should put yourself at risk, but if you feel like you're at risk, how could you live with putting somebody else at risk?
Well, yeah, I think that's the great answers. On the other hand, my wife did this documentary, Virginia Espino. It's called No Mas Bebés. She might have heard of, and so it was about the sterilization of women at LA County General Hospital. And my wife, my partner Virginia, had done most of the interviews with the immigrant women who were sterilized, but this wasn't a position of danger; it was different, right? And so she didn't really. Her thesis that she had worked on did not interview the doctors. but they were doing this documentary. They got a contract with PBS, so they had to interview the doctors. And she didn't want to do it because it was going to be really hard for her. Not because it was dangerous, but because it just wasn't going to be a pleasant experience for her. So someone else in the production team did those interviews for her. The doctors were a little bit more relaxed. You know, it's really important not to be confrontational interview, and so that person was non-confrontational. And in that case, yeah. And then, of course, and then you see the credits. You have to acknowledge that you got the help, right? You put in the end in the acknowledgments, and you give that person credit, because you don't want to create the false impression that you did all the interviews. So it's very important to be honest about that. That's all I would say.
One more, maybe? One more, please. Yes.
Just to your point, what do you say about going into an interview with a bias?
The question is, what do you say about going into an interview with a bias?
I think that if you're an author, you're a free agent. If you're representing the LA Times or, you know, the Wall Street Journal or a news organization, then you have to try to separate from your own biases, because you're representing their own compact with their readers. Every author of a book is writing the world according to themselves. And I don't think it's ethical to misrepresent yourself, but I also think that you don't have to immediately give full disclosure to everyone who you disagree with. It depends what kind of engagement you want to have. One of my books, The Inheritance, was about 3 working class families that went over 60 or 70 years from being New Deal Democrats to Reagan Republicans. And when I was starting to get to know those families, especially the third generation, which is people basically my age, and this was in the late 80s when I was starting to work, early 90s, starting to work on this book, I said, I'm going to tell you the worst thing you can ever find out about me. I voted for Jesse Jackson in the 88 primary. And because I didn't want them to think that I was writing about them because I was a Reagan Republican myself. And so let's just get that out there. But I also said to them what I felt to be true, and I think they felt I respected this in the end, which is that I wouldn't spend years writing a book just to tell you how wrong you think you are, or that I think you're racist or greedy. Because I'm someone on the left, and because this political transformation has happened, I have to try to make sense of it historically. And writing about you and your families is my way of doing that. So the promise I could make is I'm not going to endorse the Reagan doctrine, but I'm not going to make the whole point of this book hanging you out to dry and making you an object of ridicule.
Could I just add a slightly lighter bias in a way? I remember when I started reporting the House of Mondavi, which is about 4 generations of the Napa Valley wine family. I was invited somewhere. It was a very hot day. I asked for wine, ice cubes to put in my wine. And I revealed a bias, which is I knew nothing about wine, and I didn't actually care that much about wine. So, and I still maintain ice cubes in wine is great.
Let's leave it at that. Let's get some ice cubes and put them in our wine tonight. Thank you, everyone. Really, thank you so much. Thank you, Lisa.
So at the top of the hour, I want to announce that Trisha has lost her black journal. Yes. Yes. So if you picked up a black journal that looked like your black journal, and if you open it and you discover it is Trisha's, please give it to us and we will get it back to her. There is Trisha right over there looking for her journal, but still showing up at events, right? So anyway, have a look around. And in terms of lost and found, it is true. This has been an uncommonly easy week. You have not lost much, but you might begin to lose a lot in this last day. So look around, take care of each other, and let us know if we can help you find anything that you care about. In a moment, I'll be introducing Sands, who will introduce Chris for the final craft talk of the week. I want to remind you that we have a 2 o'clock panel, Close Encounters of the Third Person POV Kind. I did not come up with that title. I am just reading it out loud. With Michelle Latiolais, Greg Spatz, Diana Wagman, Josh Weil, moderated by Tom Barbash. Thank you to the participants who brought to our attention that Tom had also signed himself up for individual conferences during the 2 o'clock hour. And we were dazzled by his ambition. If you are some of those participants who signed up for conferences with Tom during the same time he is moderating the panel, he will be moderating the panel and then seeing you in the 3 o'clock hour. Which means those of you who are not having individual conferences with Tom Barbash in the 3 o'clock hour might want to show up for our traditional final panel discussion of the week, Writing Beyond the Conference, that features former alums who are on staff this week, who will talk to you about what their experience was like when they were up here as participants with black folders and manuscripts, and what they did with what they got when they went back. I'll be moderating that with Tyler Diltz, Jean Karstensen, and Shobha Rao. And then tonight is the Follies. And Sands is here to remind you that if you have hesitated to come forward to be part of the Follies, that you shouldn't hesitate much longer, right, Sands? Not much longer. You need to. Oh, we've got a little butterfly visitor. Yeah, we need to. It wants to be in the Follies. You need to talk to her ASAP. I also want to reassure you that even though we're live streaming most events here this week, if you are hesitating because you believe we would be live streaming you across the world for an event called the Follies, you have gotten us wrong. Right? What happens in the valley during the Follies stays in the valley, right? So do not hesitate. Lead with your heart. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Sands, and at the same time, I'm also going to begin to pass out, or have you pass out, on one side and the other, the handouts Chris has prepared for you today. Right? And you can just sit where you are, and I know we can do this, and you can pass the whole bunch down, and it will go smoothly. And with that, here's Sands Hall.
Thank you, amazing Lisa, and I do love the reassurance that the Follies are not broadcast. But over the years, we have had such amazing, amazing lineups, and so anybody who's made it to this particular thing and you decide at the end of the hour you know what you're going to do in the Follies, I'll give you an hour dispensation to get hold of me. It is so much fun, and I look forward to all of you being in the audience. Meanwhile, it is such an honor to have Chris Feliciano Arnold on our staff on the nonfiction and memoir side of things. He is just such a sterling, wonderful person, but here are some of his bona fides also. He lives in San Francisco, where he is the director of the MFA program in creative writing at St. Mary's College. His first book, The Third Bank of the River, so great, about which he has spoken this week, is a work of personal journalism about the Brazilian Amazon. He has written essays and journalism for The Atlantic, Harper's, The Believer, The New York Times, Folha de Sao Paulo, and more. He'll get that right. His fiction has been recognized with a National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship and published in Playboy. I only look at it for the essays and stories. The Kenyon Review, and as part of Subway Library, a partnership between the New York Public Library and the MTA. So cool. Along the way, his work's been translated into 6 languages and noted in Best American Sports Writing and Best American Short Stories. This was something Lisa pointed out so great. About this time last year, he published a remarkable essay in The Atlantic titled Naturalized Citizens Are Sacred, in which he asks and answers the question, to become Americans, we promise to defend the laws of the United States. What if defending them now puts our status at risk? This is Chris's second time on staff here in the Valley, and we're so pleased that he will be presenting the final Craft Talk of the week. Before I thoroughly introduce him, just want to give you a notice that he is playing the log. And what's the other thing? He's playing the but what's the little scrapey thing? He's using a hot pad as a washboard and a log, and he's playing with wooden fork and spoon, and he will be part of the Follies. And we couldn't actually do it without him. Meanwhile, he is going to give you the final Craft Talk of the week, Blending the Truth, Case Studies in the Fusion of Genres and Forms. Please welcome Chris Arnold.
Thank you, Sans. And I want to thank, Brett, Sans, Lisa, the entire Community of Writers family, and also just the staff, the students. It's just been an incredible week. These conversations are just so inspiring and so valuable. And I think just to have a chance to deliver a talk like this in this place and to this audience is remarkable. Thank you. So also, I realized the last Craft Talk is a little intimidating after all we've seen and heard, trying to add something to this conversation. But I also realize it's a lot to ask of you all on the last day to be here. There are many ways you can choose to spend your time, including a nap. So thank you for being here instead. So I know from our time together this week that many of us are on some kind of dual journey. As Francisco talked about in his opening talk, sometimes in our lives we're putting ourselves back together, or putting ourselves together both on the page and in our work, but also just in our living. And the time that we spend in community like this is so important, in part because we're not just popping into a classroom and then seeing each other the next week or the next month. We're getting to spend time together, break bread together, share meals, share music. And when we spend time like this together, we can see the ways in which our art intersects with our lives, and the way that our lives intersect with our art, and how if we're growing as artists, at times it can also lead to our growth as humans and lead us to a more humane art. And a person who I really look to as a guidelight in this regard, in terms of the complexity of these intersections between life and art, is the great writer Edwidge Danticat, who has this incredible book of essays called Create Dangerously, The Immigrant Artist at Work, that is at once sort of a critical and craft book, but also in many ways a personal essay and a political essay. And in that book, in the introduction, Danticat writes, "All artists, writers among them, have several stories. One might call them creation myths that haunt and obsess them." And so I think this notion of having these creation myths or these origin stories, it's something that's particularly vexing for writers of mysterious or dual or complicated origins. So for example, for immigrant writers or for queer writers, or really anyone who's writing from between or attempting to bridge two or more worlds. So for immigrant writers, oftentimes that means bridging here and there, the old country and the new country, old customs and new customs, or in my case, English and Portuguese. But all writers in some way are grappling with dual creation myths, or if you're lucky, just two, right? Oftentimes, like a whole bouquet of creation myths or origin stories. So, for example, writers who are writing in the wake of grief or loss are trying to balance the stories of before and after, of then and now. The world itself has sort of dual or conflicting or competing or complex origin stories. Eastern and Western countries have complex and competing and multifaceted origin stories, North and South. And obviously, families have many multiple creation myths and origin stories. You know, mother's version of the story, father's version of the story, and so forth. And so I think when I'm talking about blending the truth, what I mean by truth is essentially a more humane, a more complete version of the truth. And the ways that the truth can sometimes mean overlapping truths, overlapping lenses, sometimes two, sometimes more, that need to be sort of applied on top of each other. And sometimes the picture gets blurrier, sometimes it gets clearer or sharper. But it's that blending and overlapping of truths or of origin stories that I'm really interested in reading about and that I'm grappling with in my own work as well. So today, I'm going to talk about a handful of books that I consider, I guess, sort of like case studies in writers who are attempting to blend two or more truths at once, or two or more creation myths or origin stories at once, to create something new or to create something singular. Or, as Danticat says in the title of her book, to create dangerously. And so I'm going to begin with examples from the world of creative nonfiction, because I think creative nonfiction is just sort of a really uniquely malleable genre for this type of blending. But then I'm going to sort of back into a discussion of fiction as well. And then also the ways that this type of blending of truths can happen not just within one book, but across a writer's body of work. And that's one thing, just to plant a seed for all of you right now. I know that we're really here in many ways so much focused on, you know, the manuscripts we're bringing to workshop, or the manuscripts that we're bringing to our consultations, or the first book or the next book. But there's so much, there's a lot of pressure in that. And I think it's helpful to think about, as an artist, like your body of work, the way that you'd think about your body as not being like all these separate parts, but like a body of work. And so if you find yourself bogged down or discouraged with like the next thing, maybe taking a step back and thinking about your body of work, and how can some of these questions perhaps be resolved or complicated by thinking about all of your work as a body. So I have some personal experience with this. As Sans mentioned, in the case of my first book, The Third Bank of the River, it was described oftentimes as personal journalism, which I'm glad to have anyone describe my work in any way, I suppose. But personal journalism, for me, it struck me as odd in that, for me, I didn't set out to write like personal journalism. It's just that my journalism has always been personal. I was born in Brazil. I was adopted to the United States in 1981 during sort of the twilight of Brazil's dictatorship. And I didn't return to Brazil until the age of 25 to meet my birth family. And so a large part of my living, of my reading, of my writing, of my acquisition of language was about sort of, you know, as Frank mentioned the other day, sort of putting myself together and reconciling my origin stories through my writing and reporting, but also through living in my body. So when I was visiting, for example, Belo Horizonte to watch the World Cup in 2014, I mean, I was like covering that for magazines and writing pieces for magazines about that experience. But and in a way, I was on assignment for that purpose. But I was also, you know, watching these matches, watching that all unfold with my birth family, with my Brazilian brother. And when I think about the World Cup, there's certain things, for example, I don't want to remember about that World Cup. I won't speak of Germany at this moment. But I remember what I remember most vividly about that World Cup is watching, being in the hospital when my niece, Luana, was born. And so for me, that journalism has always been personal. And likewise, in 2018, when I was in Brazil to cover the so-called rise and thankfully fall, the brief rise of Jair Bolsonaro, I was writing about, on assignment to cover Brazil on the eve of authoritarian rule, but I was there amidst that with my family, asking myself, would my family be seduced by his origin story of Brazil? What did that political transformation mean, yes, for the country, but also for my family, for the people I love and care about? And so in The Third Bank of the River, yes, I was exploring the country, but also my own identity. And I was sort of exploring two Amazons at once. One is the sort of vision of the Amazon that I had received as an American growing up through the sort of colonial extractive lens of the Amazon, but then also grappling with the reality of the Amazon as I perceived it as both a reporter and a visitor and a Brazilian on the river. So that's not to say that I was doing anything particularly new. There's examples of this kind of writing from all across the world, from every tradition. And we get them about like Mark Twain, like Life on the Mississippi, grappling with life on the Mississippi in nonfiction versus, say, Huckleberry Finn, or Ernest Hemingway, George Orwell, James Baldwin. The way that Toni Morrison was integrating her visions of truth both through her editorial work as a publisher, but also through her essays in nonfiction and through her fiction, and grappling with these same obsessions across many forms. Joan Didion, Leslie Marmon Silko, the list goes on. And so while none of this is necessarily new, I do think in the last decade or so, thankfully, the aperture of the world of US literature, at least, has widened to include so many more voices and perspectives, and that necessarily includes more and more complex origin stories. And so we can look across the contemporary landscape and see writers who are doing just these incredible things with form and genre, not because they want to do something like necessarily avant-garde, but because it's just them. It's their origin story is singularly complex and multifaceted, so they necessarily have to find a form or a genre to suit that. So I'm going to share a few different examples of books, and frankly, I guess that the handout is really just a list of books. I know that the books that I'm going to be talking about today, because I know that when I come to events and talks like this, I'm always like, oh, I have to remember that, but hopefully I've just written down the books for you, and I encourage you to just pick up whichever ones resonate for you, and hopefully they'll take you to the next book or so forth. But the first one that I want to pick up on, because it's a relatively new book, and just a fantastic example of exactly what I'm talking about. I have an incomplete set of visual aids here because I tend to overpack, and my wife had to keep me from packing 500 pounds of books, so I only have a handful. But the first one is We Survive the Night by Julian Brave Noisecat, which came out in 2025. Just by show of hands, how many of you have picked this up or heard of it or seen it so far? Okay, so this will hopefully be new and interesting to most of us. So this is Julian Brave Noisecat has written here a book that is, at once, it's a father-son narrative. It's about a son trying to reconcile who his father was, his relationship to his father. But then also, it's a work of investigative journalism that is about Indigenous oppression and of violence against Indigenous people, but also stories of Indigenous resilience and storytelling. And he does this through a collection that a memoir that blends his own life story and family story and oral history with a collection of Coyote myths. And in his early chapters, Noisecat is very clear about why he's doing this. He's sort of teaching us why the book is written this way before he even begins. And so he writes, "To hold the story in these pages, I have turned to the silenced narrative traditions of the Coyote people. Like other indigenous peoples, the Salish divide oral narratives related to our history, philosophy, and environment into two categories: Lexeyem and Sepektuil. Lexeyem are oral histories of recalled events, often from the storyteller's own life and genealogy. Sepektuil are stories about the creation and transformation of the world, often dealing with the more distant past and the supernatural. This book is partially Lexeyem, relating a series of interlinked stories of my life, family, and genealogy. But it is also Sepektuil, retelling some of the greatest hits from the epic misadventures of the trickster coyote who helped creators shape the world into its present geological, environmental, and cultural forms. And so what he's done here is taken in another world, in another time, maybe this writer would have had to, I use that in scare quotes, write this as 2 books. Like, well, you write like your memoir and then maybe write this as another book. But thankfully, we're in a moment where it's possible for a writer to actually have both the courage and the capacity and the ability and supportive publishing house and editor and so forth to say, hey, why don't we try to blend and overlap these modes of telling and these modes of truth into one book? And the result is, I would argue, is far more complex, heartbreaking, hilarious, vivid, and provocative than any one of those truths would have been if you would try to write these as 2 separate books. The degree of difficulty is huge, and we'll come back to that later, but it's also just an incredibly rewarding read. And I think one of the things that we can take away from it is just there's so much just in watching writers attempt this, and let alone it's a sort of a high wire act. But if you even have aspirations to try to do something like this, the more you can read and the more you can watch writers attempt to do this kind of blending, the better off you are, because the way you do it is going to be naturally different because you don't have the same origin stories as Julian Brave Noise Cat. But you have your own singular origin stories. So watching the ways that many writers try to do this will sort of help you along your own way. So, another brilliant example, and I'm using some more recent examples in part because then hopefully you'll just go pick up and support some of these new books, but also just to show you that this is actually possible. And I realized it's possible to pull something like this off in the contemporary publishing landscape, I guess is what I'm saying. Because I know that a lot of you are thinking this week as you're hearing from editors and agents, like, what are people looking for? But I just want you to see through these just really audacious examples that it's not necessarily easy, but it is possible. There are editors out there who will support really audacious attempts at work like this. So the next example that I want to share is this book, Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age, by Vauhini Vara. By show of hands, is anyone familiar with this book? And all? I'm sure some of you may have read at least some of the excerpts from this book. But essentially, what Vara has created here is a memoir in essays merged with tech journalism that sort of explores what it means to be alive in like this digital internet age. And it's sort of a combination of her coming of age as an internet user back in the modem days of like AOL CDs through to the present day, and our society's sort of coming of age into this technological era, merged with the story of her grappling with her sister's terminal illness as she was coming up and the ways in which she used the internet to make sense of what was happening to her sister. So, for example, she writes early on in the book, and this, by the way, is a passage that is interwoven into what is otherwise like an investigative chapter about like how Google became powerful, right? So she writes, "Of course, our search histories are monetizable. It was true then, and it remains true, that a search at its most intimate is a porthole into the depths of human desire. One recent morning, I searched for Ewing sarcoma prognosis on Google, and within maybe 3 seconds was reading an American Cancer Society page specifying a 5-year survival rate of 63%, though the rate was lower if the cancer had metastasized, which my sister's had at the time of her first diagnosis." So notice how even within the context of the shape of one paragraph, she's taking us from like an economic lens of like what is search, like at an economic like business level, to what is search on like a human desire level, to what is search for her in searching for what the story of how to help her sister. That alone is dazzling, and yet then she manages to take later on in the book her own personal Google search history and turn it into what I could only describe as like a brilliant lyric poem about search. This is chapter 2, Searches. And I'll just read just a little bit of this just so you can see and hear what she's done with what was the most banal thing, right? You'd think of like how many times we just search throughout the day, but she's managed through this blending of experience and truth and form to turn into something I think is beautiful and profound. So this is just a sample from Search. What does a womb smell like? What to say about yourself on wedding website? What to do if you don't want wedding gifts? What predicts divorce? What came before God? What are humans made of? What are computers made of? What do flower girls throw? What a fetus feels? What is truth? What makes someone charismatic? What is the brain made of? What is ear pods? What rough beast slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? What are the side effects of the NuvaRing? What is solutionism? What is internet hippo? What is wrong with Rex Tillerson? What is Zoloft for? What happens if you take too many puffs of an inhaler? What to do if your inhaler doesn't help? What kind of meditation should I do? What is a Bakersfield resident called? What should I do with my life? So if I didn't make it clear at the beginning, this is literally just culled from her actual like saved Google search history. And she goes on for, 5 or 6 pages in a way that is just, it builds in its tone, its mood, and it's just the capacity for emotion generated by this curation of Google searches is just incredible. And I think it's something that can only be accomplished by blending these forms and genres of truth into a form that can only exist in this book. And we'll come back to what Vara's fiction does in this regard as well. So another just incredible example, this is my last visual aid, is Valeria Luisueli's book is another great example, Tell Me How It Ends. But just by show of hands, anyone familiar with this? Okay, excellent. And we'll talk about her fiction as well. But this slim volume, as they say, recounts her experience serving as an interviewer and an interpreter in the New York City's federal immigration system, recording and sort of cataloging these stories of crossing of migrants, often children who are answering a questionnaire and that begins with the simple question, why did you come to the United States? And early in the book, Luiselli writes, but nothing is ever that simple. The children's stories are always shuffled, stuttered, always shattered beyond the repair of a narrative order. The problem with trying to tell their story is that it has no beginning, no middle, no end. And so here she is trying to reconcile just the incredible complexity of the stories, the incredible and devastating emotional work of recording and capturing these stories, and then also trying to ask, how do I actually shape this into a form that makes sense and that guards that safeguards the privacy of these young subjects of these interviews. And in part, the challenge is reconciling those stories, but also, which again, it's a whole constellation of creation myths, of origin stories. These are young migrants telling their own origin stories, and here we have an artist who's trying to find a way to make sense of those, but also to make sense of that within the larger story of the Americas and the story of her own family. So it's one of these things where it's no surprise that to even undertake something like this, you have to be a little bit obsessed and more than a little bit haunted to keep going back to this work. And I'm not even talking about the literary work. I'm just talking about the work of the interviewing and the transcribing. And then let alone, in order to try to fashion something artful and literary out of this, you have to have some degree of obsession or haunting. So it's no surprise that there's something deeply resonant within these origin stories and creation myths and the author's own. Later in the book, she writes, "It is the summer of 2014. We're waiting for our green cards to be granted or denied." This is the author and her partner and their children. And in the meantime, we decide to go on a family road trip. We will drive from Harlem, New York to a town in Cochise County, Arizona, near the U.S.-Mexico border. I suppose deeper down, we were simply asking ourselves, perhaps for the first time, that same question I now ask children at the beginning of each intake interview. why did you come to the United States? So here we see the personal journey overlapping with the day-to-day work of transcribing and recording these interviews. And the result is a book that can only be in this form. And it's one that captures truths that can only be captured when these many truths are sort of blended and overlapped in these overlapping lenses. And so these are just a handful of examples of, blending truths within books. Like, how do you do this within a book? But going back to this notion of a body of work and putting yourself back together and of haunting and obsession, I think it's also worth thinking about how does this process play out across books, across projects, across an artist's entire body of work. So just by show of hands, like, how many of you are either obsessed and or haunted? Okay, good. So there we got like almost all the hands. So everybody's like obsessed and or haunted. So let's start from there. So going back to Edwidge Danticat, many of you know her debut novel, Breath, Eyes, Memory, which was published first in 1994 and tells the story of a young girl's migration from Haiti to New York at the age of 12. And so our young protagonist leaves an aunt who raised her until she was age 12 to go to New York City to meet and reunite with a mother that she barely knows. And if you haven't read it, I pick it up on your way home. It's an incredible coming-of-age story about identity, memory, loss, about the formation of countries, the formation of families, and about how all of these things can be laden with grief and scars. Interestingly, that novel began as an essay that then later found its way into becoming fictionalized and becoming a novel. And in a way, it's an autobiographical novel, but it's also deeply fictional and beautifully rendered as a novel. But a decade later, so in 2004, Danticat's real uncle, Joseph Danticat, who helped raise her in Haiti until the age of 12, before she, in reality, went to New York at the age of 12 and met her family that she didn't know well. Her uncle attempted to flee Haiti after his church was destroyed during a battle between U.S. peacekeepers and local militants. So her uncle would ultimately and tragically perish in an immigrant detention, and she recounts all of this in a memoir, Brother, I'm Dying, where she tells the story of her uncle in Haiti, of her father in the United States, of the history of Haiti and of the United States involvement in Haiti, all in this story that blends family history, world history, and journalism, all in just incredible, beautiful, lyric and clearly reported language that is doing a lot of the things that we were describing earlier with Julien Brave Noisecat, in terms of just finding a way to blend two modes of storytelling. Now, in the case of Danticat, the nonfiction followed the fiction, but there's not really, these things don't have to come in any order, right? It's like Louis Selly says, nothing's that simple. So you don't have to, like, you're haunted. If you're haunted, you're haunted. You can't like put your ghosts in order and say like you come through the door first and then you get to come through the door second. Like, you're obsessed because you can't put things in order in part. So it's not as if this roadmap says, well, begin with your novel and then go to nonfiction. That's not how it works. These things can come and go in any order. We can't sequence the ghosts. So if we consider, for example, Vara, who wrote Searches, that book about technology, it follows her 2022 novel, The Immortal King Rao, which tells the story of the rise to power of a tech CEO in this like near future who like urges the world towards corporatocracy. And that novel follows Vara's many, many years covering technology for places like Bloomberg, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and so forth. So the whole time, even when Vara was, on assignment, so to speak, she was still putting herself together, putting her worldview together, reconciling all of these obsessions and ghosts and so forth into something that would, at one season of life, become a novel, and another season of life become an essay, and another season of life become a book of essays. So these are authors who are just continuing to return to these hauntings, to these obsessions. They may come in first in fiction and then in nonfiction, or first in fiction and then to nonfiction, but either way, they're almost just kind of returning to the scene of the crime, right? They're coming back to the same hauntings, back to the same obsessions. So for example, in the case of Valeria Luiselli, this essay collection, Tell Me How It Ends, is, you could say it's a precursor, but it's almost like a catalyst to her novel, Lost Children Archive, which is the story of a family crossing the United States from New York to Arizona, learning about sort of the horrors of immigration and asylum and detention. And she's described the novel as a megaphone for her rage, a megaphone for the rage of this experience, right? So we can see how one book may feed into another in these almost like echo chambers. And I think that's ultimately what I mean when I talk about having like a body of work. And I think that's something that you can see in so much of the work of the staff here. Just by way of example, and once again, I didn't expect Francisco Goldman to be sitting in the audience, but I'll say Francisco Goldman's Long Night of White Chickens is a return to these sort of same haunted grounds as he was reporting on for years during the 80s, and that he would later revisit in The Art of Political Murder. Hector Tobar's The Barbarian Nurseries is a novel that is dramatizing the Los Angeles landscape of his LA Times reporting, and it's also addressing themes of identity and belonging and what a city is that we see again in Our Migrant Souls. So we have these authors who are sort of traversing the same landscapes, returning to the same hauntings and obsessions, yes, within these really complex hybrid books, but also across an entire hybrid body of work. In my case, I think for me, the novel I'm currently working on is essentially, it's a fictional reconstruction of my own adoption story. So trying to figure out how I got here, how I got to be me, how I got to be in this body, in this place. And again, it's sort of personal journalism turned to fiction. At times it has been essay, at times it's been journalism. At times the work itself has been journalism, as I've had to excavate documents related to my own origin story. And for now, at least, it's in the form of a novel. But the idea, again, is it's sort of a blending and a merging of these different modes and genres and forms of truth in hope of just essentially not giving up, in hope of just not being silent, and trying to create something new. And as Danticat writes, returning to create dangerously, there are many interpretations of what it means to create dangerously. And Albert Camus, like the poet Osip Mandelstam, suggests that it's creating in a revolt against silence. Creating when both the creation and the reception, the writing and the reading, are dangerous undertakings, disobedient to a directive. And I know again from our conversations this week that whether you're an immigrant writer or a queer writer or whatever your origin stories may be, all of us in some way are writing against silences. All of us in some way are writing in ways that are disobedient to a directive. There may be someone somewhere who does not want you to write the book that you are writing. And that's to say, it is disobedient, and that's kind of why it's dangerous. And I want to be clear about the downsides so that I'm not just like, go forth, because there are considerable downsides. So I'll just outline a few of the downsides really quickly. One, trying to blend hybrid works is kind of dangerous in a world that is just relentlessly prefers categories. Publishing especially and commercial publishing especially just loves categories. One reason why online book shopping is so dangerous relative to, say, an indie bookstore is its relentless focus on categories and links and so forth. So if you are trying to do something that defies categories or that blends categories, it's going to make it harder to shop for online, for example. And it has all sorts of, so just know that it's, as much as I like to say, look, you can do it. Look at these books. You can do something like this. I can't say this with certainty, but I do think the agents, the editors, the publishers who will take a risk on books like these are rare. They are out there, but they are rare. So know that. And so I may be completely conflicting advice you've gotten from an editor or agent this week who's like, what if you simplified this? And here I am like, just smash it all together. But anyway, so and oftentimes too, like readers prefer genres too. Readers prefer categories, and that's great. I love reading books that are like one thing. One thing done beautifully is also simple is the hardest thing to be. So, I love those kind of books, but just know that you are kind of, I wouldn't say undertaking something as an uphill battle, but you're kind of swimming against the current a bit if you try something like this. But I would say it's worth it. So you may find that people encourage you to simplify, encourage you to pare things down, or save this for the next book, or this or that. And, take that too, and weigh the two things. But just know there are some downsides. But I'll give you at least like 4 things to take from this talk aside from the handout. So these are I think my 4 not recommendations, ideas. Number 1 is I think it's okay to have secret shadow projects, and let one work feed the work of another. And if you have like a secret project, what if it just wasn't your secret project? What if it was just another project, right? And just, it's okay to have multiple projects. So give yourself permission. If nobody's ever given you permission to have multiple projects or to write in multiple genres or forms, this is your permission. Try that. Number 2, along with that, broaden your methods as well. So if you're a novelist, maybe research for your novel using the modes of a journalist or an anthropologist. If you're a journalist, maybe research for your next story by reading some novels about the place you're going. Broaden and mix up your methods of experiencing and reading about the world, or listening to music, or watching films. So just think of yourself as you're blending your writing practices in forms and genres. Do the same with your reading practices and generally your art consumption practices, I guess. Number 3, nothing is wasted. So you're following your obsessions for a reason. Save your work, save your research, create your own archive. You don't know when you may come back to those things. You don't know what book 5 years from now in your body of work may harken back to something that you're discovering today, working on the book that you're working on today. So as you think about your book and your body of work, think of all the research and notes and things that you're collecting as your personal archive. And if you think that sounds like presumptuous or pretentious, I'm not, Nobel Prize winners have archives. No, you have an archive. You have an archive. So build that. And then lastly, I kind of want to scratch this one off, but this is maybe just me coping. So this is either advice for you or just me coping. Don't worry so much about being finished. It is important to finish. Don't get me wrong. You should finish, and I want you to finish. Do finish. And polish your work and take good care of it and do all the things to get finished work out there. Yes. But also, don't let the pressure to finish break the spell of your obsessions and your hauntings and so forth, right? If you are good and haunted, and based on the show of hands earlier, almost everybody under this tent right now is good and haunted. You're gonna stay haunted no matter what. I'm afraid to tell you, even 1 book, 2 books, 5 books, nothing's gonna stop you from being haunted. So just if you accept that you're obsessed, if you accept that you're good and haunted, that'll take off some of the pressure to finish. But yes, do finish. So that you can come back and read at the alumni reading and be finished. That does feel good. So anyhow, with that, I hope you pick up the handout of recommended reading and some of the books on there. I hope you find a book that takes you in a new direction. And I just wish you luck telling and retelling your stories and being obsessed and haunted. And thanks for your time and attention. Lisa, do we do Q&As or no? Yeah, okay. If anybody has a question, I'm happy to answer a question. Or go take a nap. Or go recharge with coffee for the next event. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Hey, Clark.
Well, as you know, I came to you earlier this week to talk about my project, and we both agree it's integrating, from some perspectives anyway, you could say it's sort of cross-genre
That's a great question for one of the agents around here. And I mean, you've all probably talked to more agents this week than I have. So I guess that'd be a good question for them. I think the books wouldn't be appearing on shelves if there weren't people out there willing to take that risk. So yeah, rare but not impossible. But a great book should be rare, right? And so if you're trying to write a work of art that is singular and rare, maybe that means that by necessity, the person who's going to try and help you get it out there is a rare and singular person. That could be very Pollyannish, though. I'd be curious what the agents would be like. I don't know. I'm going to ask somebody what they think of this. Yeah, Rebecca.
So how do you balance going back and forth? Because I know I also have a novel that I pitch aside while I work on the memoir. I'm afraid to go back to the other one because then I won't finish.
Mm-hmm.
One or the other. So is there some way that you try to balance working on multiple things?
I mean, I alternate between projects. So I feel like every project needs time to rest, time to just let the pages sit before you come back to it so that you can see them afresh. So I think one benefit of having multiple things going on is you're working on your novel, you finish that, right? And then you let it rest, or excuse me, your memoir, you finish that draft, definitely finish drafts. I'm already walking back my advice, but finish and then let that rest and then move on to the next project. And that way you have something. It's almost like if you like to cook, if you like to have different burners, right? You have some things on the front burner, some things on the back burner. But I think the advantage of having multiple projects is you don't lose the momentum. You're working on something. Because I think if you have one project and you finish and you put that aside to come back to this in 3 months, well, it's kind of hard to get back going. So having something else that you can have in the mix and alternate between projects, I think, is really valuable. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, Francisco.
We try to get a book contract for a novel that's going to be mixed genres. And some of your research involves kind of journalistic research. Do you think it helps to get yourself published in journalism about the thing that you're doing?
I think so, and I think that Vauhini's work is a good example of that. That first of all, building familiarity with the world that you're writing about, and then secondly, building a bit of a profile as somebody who thinks about those things and who's thought deeply and knows about it. And that way, it sort of doesn't seem as I'm putting on my I guess, do agents wear hats? I'm putting on my agent hat right now and thinking, if something comes in, I want to know why this subject for this writer. And so I think doing some of that work, whether it's in journalism or personal essay or something, probably helps set the table a bit more. Yeah. Awesome. Oh, yes.
Ask you to put the writer hat back on. I feel like
Do writers wear hats? Yes. Writers definitely wear hats. Yeah.
from a craft perspective, I feel like I really love genre bending things, and then as I've learned more and written more and been in workshop more, I'm also able to see when stuff is cluttered or not
Mm-hmm.
or clashing with each other. And so how do you sort of identify when that sort of fusion of form is serving the book and when it is getting in its own way?
Yeah, I see this a lot. I think these types of projects, these types of books are really attractive, and there can be this impulse toward collage and smashing things together and seeing what happens. And I think part of that, for me, at least in my own work, but then also in responding to work in classroom, is that process is sort of an oscillation, right? Stuff it and then clear it out a bit, and then stuff it and then clear it out a bit. So it doesn't have to, the size or complexity or the number of facets of a piece doesn't have to just be linear, you're just adding. Sometimes you're doing addition by subtraction and taking things away. But you won't know what to take away if you haven't put it in to begin with. And I think that's one of the things that I see happen, is that there's so much advice out there around focusing and streamlining and simplifying, that I think that can prevent people from even trying to add things in the first place. You can always take it out. So try combining things, and if it's not working, just Control Z, right? Just undo it. That's way easier than never making the attempt in the first place. And that's why I think it's so helpful to just read as widely as you can in these kinds of work, to just see what kinds of things can be combined, right? Good question. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one is like oral histories, listening to oral histories, I think is incredible. Going to a physical library and asking, there's somebody at your local library called the reference librarian. There's literally somebody waiting who's like spending their whole day waiting for somebody like, it's KB, right? Waiting for you to come in and ask a question so that this person can then get up and show you things that will blow your mind. So for me, it's like oral histories, old maps, old physical media, the microfiche. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Oh yeah. The microfiche. Yeah. So just like get in there. And this is something I'm really hopeful about. I know there's like a move back towards like physical media, but like physical research, so like get in there, listen, feel, touch things, and yeah, your reference librarian is like the all-powerful human Google of the knowledge. Yes, so I hope that helps. We can talk more about your project in particular, though, one-on-one. But anyway, thank you all for being here. We'll see you all soon.
All right. No, you sit. I go get them. You sit, Michelle. I go get the water. Okay. All right. I'm going to say very little right now because I'm moderating the 3 o'clock panel. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Tom Barbash, and I'm going to go get some cool water for these folks and enjoy Close Encounters of the Third POV Kind. That wasn't your title, was it, Tom? No. Yeah, we don't know who came up with that title, but here you all are. It worked.
Hello there. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here on my second day too. I was talking to people at the house. I don't know how much I miss this place sometimes until I'm here, and just the level of conversations that have been happening over the last few days, and especially when you have other things dragging on your attention. This is such a great place to care about the work and care about each other's work and what's going on in the world with kindred spirits, and it's just been amazing. And this is an all-star panel. And some people I haven't seen for a while. Josh, how many? It's been like 7 years or something. Yeah, I met you. I remember Josh got in touch with me, and he said, can you join me in conversation? I have 2 books out. Yeah, and then do you remember that? And I read both books, and they happen to be amazing, so it was wonderful. And then we've taught together. And I just met Diana. I know Greg forever, and Michelle, I think now forever from being here. So in terms of I think of third person point of view, I was telling Michelle that when I was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, I got just hammered by Frank Conroy, and part of the reason was that he got tired of my first person stories, that everything I was writing was in first person, and I think he thought I ought to try writing in third. So I did, after he did that. And I think in many ways, a lot of my students, when I ask them about point of view, they love first person because they really think it gets into the character, it captures their cadences, their interiority. And then so you have to make the case that third person can do that, and many other things. And I think, and all you can attest to it. I mean, if you've written, my last novel was in first person, and you realize how much you miss the third person when you're writing a novel in first person, in part. Well, yes, but there's so many things that you can do in third person, but there's so many different approaches to it. I was thinking my first novel was written in close third. I mean, there's omniscient third, but there's so many. There's also how much your third person narrator, whether the reader is ahead of that narrator and we know things before they do, or whether they know the whole story before we do. But it's also just I brought in something from Flannery O'Connor's Mystery and Manners, and so just in terms of what, if you're thinking about the claustrophobia that sometimes happens in first, and this is what a third person sentence can do. O'Connor writes, all the sentences in Madame Bovary could be examined with wonder, but there's one in particular that always stops me in admiration. Flaubert has just shown us Emma at the piano with Charles watching her. He says, she struck the notes with aplomb and ran from top to bottom of the keyboard without a break. Thus shaken up, the old instrument, whose strings buzzed, could be heard at the other end of the village when the window was open, and often the bailiff's clerk, passing along the high road, bareheaded and in list slippers, stopped to listen, his sheet of paper in his hand. Which is just remarkable. And then there's a William Maxwell, I think, a short novel in which we're suddenly in a dog's point of view, and it's just, right. So, yeah. But anyway, enough of me, and then I just want to hear from you all. When you talk to students, when you think about yourself, when do you decide the third person is the way to go, and what does it offer you, and what are the challenges? And maybe begin with Josh and move back towards me here.
Hey everybody. Yeah, I think for me it's where I want the focus to be, the reader's focus to be, right? And so with first person, if I'm interested in primarily the character's resistance to say giving out information, what might be happening interior-wise with characterologically, that's where the focus lies, as opposed to some aspects of narrative. Let me just give an example. So, I have a short story in my collection called The First Bad Thing, and it centers on two characters who are in a romance, and they open their romance by saying they're not going to ask each other anything about their pasts, right? I didn't want it to be about what was going on in one of them, what the resistance was about that past, about that past, but instead I want it to be about how the relationship could build with that limitation, right? And so it was important to be in third person in that, because I think in first person it would have become about, well, why is this character so reluctant to give out what's going on in the past? So a lot of it for me kind of comes down to where I want the focus to lie, and it steers it that way.
Hi. Well, a lot of you heard me read last night, and a couple people asked me if it was memoir, and it was not, but it was first person. And it's interesting because there is a book within this book that I read last night. She's a writer, and she does begin to write, and the book that she's writing is magical, or a magical realism sort of story, and that's in third person. And I really had to put the book within the book in third person. I tried to write it in first at first, and we were so confused. Even I was confused between which character was which, right? So, and which was which. So the third person was perfect for that. And I had the advantage of the first person writer being able to think about what the third person character was thinking before she wrote it into the book. But I think I never thought of writing this book in anything but first person, and it's my first person book. I just really wanted to be with her. Now I want her out of my head, please. But, I needed to be deep in there. And that was first person for me.
Hey, everybody. Is this on? Yes. So I feel like, when I first started writing, I did everything was first person. It was all I could do was first person. And kind of the breakthrough for me in the very beginning was deciding I'm going to write a story that feels like a memoir. I'm going to make it like fake memoir, fake retrospective first person. And the idea was to be like so kind of like, I don't know, just kind of sound like it was a memoir. And that was kind of a breakthrough for me because it allowed me to like have just enough distance from this character and just enough proximity to him that I could finally tell a halfway decent story. And and then when I went around with that book, everyone kind of did assume it was a memoir, which was a little bit, problematic because it isn't. My mother did not she did try to kill herself, but not the way this one did. And I didn't have an affair with her best friend and things like this. Anyway, there came a point where I just got, I just felt like I couldn't do it anymore. Like I'd done all these various first person masks and I was just like, I just couldn't do it anymore. So everything ever since pretty much has been third person. Very occasionally, like something comes up, it feels like, yeah, this has got to be first person. It's really not very often because I feel like third person just gives you a bigger canvas. You can kind of do everything you can do in first person in third person as long as you're willing to like move the camera really close into their perspective and kind of pick up the stain of their consciousness and the language, and you can do it all in third person, and you can jump around, change perspectives, and you can give the overview. But I still love reading first person. I got tired of my ways of doing it, and yeah, I mean that's kind of where it's at. Except I also do enjoy, I don't know if this counts, but plural first person is kind of fun, and that's very different, I think, and that I still do kind of probably too often.
Michelle?
Did you want to respond to? So, yeah, Greg is referring to a collective first person. So
like the Virgin Suicides. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
or Then We Came to the End by Josh Ferris. Yeah. So, and the book that Tom mentioned by William Maxwell is So Long, See You Tomorrow, won the National Book Award, brilliant little novel. These people are a lot smarter than I am. I never start from a technical place. I never say I'm going to write in first person, third person. This is not where I start at all. And so I often write 60 pages trying to find what is the right vantage on a character or on a situation that is very confusing to me, that I want to write into. I think you can do anything in third person that you can do in first person and vice versa. I also think it entirely depends on who's writing the third person and how, where the vantage is or where the distances are in the delivery. And second person, I think it matters tremendously who's writing the second person. So I just don't start out thinking about technical things. I'm thinking about the interiority of my characters.
But the question I want to ask all of you is, occasionally when you read, you see things that are done in third person that you hadn't imagined you would do in your own. So if you read like Mary Gateskill, and I'm thinking about this story I've taught Daisy's Valentine, it's close third person, but it can step outside and really observe the characters in a very unkind way, but a very truthful way. But then you're like, oh, can you do that? Because I thought if I'm in close third, I'm kind of in their perspective. So I'm wondering about some experiences you've had along the way where you've maybe there's something's been opened up by your own reading in terms of the possibilities of third person. So.
Like a distant third person, a brilliant example of it is Outer Dark by Cormac McCarthy, in which we watch Rinthi from afar. And her looking for her baby, which has been begotten on her by her brother. And you're in hell. It's in Outer Dark, but it's a somewhat distant third person. But it is amazing how much access you have to her interiority just by watching what she does.
Greg, I'm really interested in what you said about worrying, and I think with all of you that first person sounds like you. I'm wondering, is that another good reason to write in third, because you can really you can write yourself and they'll assume it's not you because it's, or maybe, so it allows you sort of a greater freedom in that way. I don't know. Then it doesn't have that natural assumption that first person has.
I think that's true, but I think the problems with first person are way bigger than that. Frank Conroy, since you mentioned him, I don't know if he said this to you guys, but he would say it to us. He would say, just don't do it. Just don't write in first person, and don't do it until you've read Remains of the Day. Just don't do it. And he would talk about the problem is just all these layers of irony that come with, does the author know more than the character? How much more does the author know than the character? How much irony is there in this? Just all these kind of thorny things. I don't know that he's right, because obviously I hadn't read Remains of the Day, and everything I'd written was in first person, and I'd gotten into the workshop. So clearly he was not right. But at the same time, I think, there's some truth in it. Like first person seems easy, and it's really not. It's very, very tricky. And in some ways he's right. Like read Remains of the Day and The Collector and stuff like that really play with your perceptions and what you can and can't know. And like as far as third person goes, the person that, since you mentioned William Maxwell, the other book of his that I really love is They Came Like Swallows, which does some amazing stuff with third person because it's, 3 different characters and the voice shifts just very subtly between each one. And the first one, you're in the head of this little kid. I think he's like 8, 10 maybe, I don't know, Bunny. And it's very autobiographical. And what he manages to do in that is just incredible because the language is like very sophisticated. He doesn't dumb the language down at all, but the perceptions and the perspective are so tight to this little kid that within a sentence you're locked in. And then he moves to the older brother, language shifts slightly, and then he ends in the father's perspective. And all the way through it, there's this confluence of all 3 voices, and yet they're different, and they're all looking at the same thing. I'm not going to say what it is because it's heartbreaking, and it's more heartbreaking if you don't know what it is.
I just wanted to jump in for a second on that. The idea of, being scared of of writing in first person and it being as misconstrued as you, and then also this idea of language. Because for me, there's a certain, I actually find that it's easier to write as me in the third person, because the first person so much is about really channeling voice, and it feels like a very different experience to me that I've had. And it's one of my favorite experiences, but some of the most powerful writing experiences I've had is when I hear a voice and I feel a voice, and then whereas third person, I'm moving forward in the narrative, and I'm writing it in the tone, and I'm very precise about how I'm approaching it. First person, it feels like I'm not driving it. It's very different. It's like, okay, well, this is the voice, and now I've got to kind of fit my ideas into how this voice would tell it, right?
But let me just ask you one thing, Josh, because I love that, and I do agree with you. First person feels like I've channeled a voice, but some of my favorite writers in third person, and then if I'm at my best, I can occasionally hit this. It stems out of how we capture a character's thoughts. Yeah. But if you're reading something in third person, all of a sudden you realize the whole paragraph has been in first person, but it's suddenly slipped into the language and the thoughts. It was like, get the fuck out of here! Suddenly it's like a direct exclamation, and then we're back into third, and it has. So that's when I think third rocks, because it can do this thing. You can step back. You can have the English Patient where we suddenly get like 30 pages about sand, in the middle of it, and then come back to the story. But it can go deep inside the head in a way that feels almost freeform. So.
It can. I'm going to say two kind of almost contradictory things, but third does rock. But first, also you can choose, and I've had some of the most fun I've had has been like, a first person. Someone might mention this: a first person narrator that chooses to tell. I think this was maybe you chooses to tell a story in third person, right? And that allows you to have that same kind of freedom all of a sudden, and yet inject questions that are overt to the reader in the third person of, how much does this first person narrator know? Because you're kind of acknowledging almost that authority. That first person narrator becomes the authorial voice. Which I find is really fun to play with. That said, again, with third person, I'm not sure you can do everything in third person and first person, all the same things. And the only thing I'm thinking about Outer Dark. Yeah, I know, right? But but I'm thinking about Outer Dark. I'm thinking about Cormac McCarthy, and language-wise, you're limited in first person, right? Okay, whatever. You're probably right, Michelle. Somebody can put. I mean, just in general, but like. Sure, you could pull off a character who speaks in Cormac McCarthy's authorial voice, but it would be freaking hard. Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, maybe someone can do that, but there's in third person. Often, when I'm thinking about why do I go towards third person with something, is because all of a sudden I'm hearing. A lot of it is what I'm hearing. If I hear a story in a spoken voice, that feels very different to me than hearing it in a written voice. And the written voice is like, that gives me the freedom. When I said didn't feel like I didn't worry about people seeing it as me or being too much me in first person, that's because the third person feels more like me. And that's where the danger is too. I can get caught in my authorial writerly voice that I love, in a way that feels like, this is me, but is problematic. It's tricky. But it gives me the freedom to say, I'm going to approach, how dense, how complex do I want this sentence to be? That's my third person decision in a way that in first person I wouldn't be making. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It seems to me a lot of romance and a lot of YA is written in first person. And like you were saying, Greg, it limits language in a way. If it's first person, your 8-year-old protagonist will speak a certain way. And it sort of simplifies it. But in third person, they could have all the complex thoughts that 8-year-olds have, but they may not have the language to articulate it. And it seems like an interesting choice to me, this sort of move in YA to write in first person, because somehow their characters just aren't as interesting to me in that way. So.
And also, I mean, and from the first, there's you know this story by Lars Gustafsson? I think it's Greatness Strikes. Where there's something. And then because it's a character's got like a 70 IQ, right? But it's incredibly complex and rich language. Yeah. So one thing, I often talk to my students in terms of first and third, but that I think about who the listener is, that narrators, that the reader is the other side of the pillow. They get everything. They get even more than the spouse will get or the best friend. And then there's that kind of third person is sort of like we're watching these people, and there's like but we're in kinship together. In a way, it's sort of one third person writer that I like is Daniel Handler, and even the Lemony Snicket. It's kind of like, let's come in and talk about these strange people, and I'll give you some context about it, and the sheer delight of sharing the story with the reader. But is that something that comes into third person, is what sort of relationship you're going to have with the reader? To anybody.
Could I just mention a book? I don't mean to be... Is this one? There we go. Yeah. Emma Donahue's Room. The narrator is I think Jack is like 6, right? 6. And of course he's never left this room. His mother's been abducted, and she's given birth to him in this room. I thought it was an amazing choice by Donahue to attempt this, and I think it's amazing.
Successful.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
it first or third?
Well, I think it's first, but I don't.
I think it's close third.
It might be close third. Well, first and close third, yeah. Anyway, it's just a narrator that is young, but who's had an experience that no one else has had in the world, right?
Well, that begs a question. So maybe it's just too broad with third. There's close third and there's distant third. Maybe let's start with close third. If you've written it, what are the advantages and disadvantages of close third?
I don't know that I see any disadvantages, I guess, because if you're in close third, you can do anything. Like, you don't have to stay there is the thing, right? So you can be in close third, and then you can back off and give the overview. You can switch point of view. So you have, and at the same time, if you're really close, you've got you're like every bit as intimate with that character as if they were first person, and so you've got all the advantages and none of the disadvantages, kind of as far as I can tell. At least in my own experience, that's how it goes. Flannery O'Connor came up. I like her as a model for that trick, that free indirect discourse trick that so many people do, but she does it really well, where all of a sudden you're hearing this very inflected Southern vernacular creeping into the narrative third person, and it's the character's voice, and it's just great, so it's like you're in first and third at the same time, and you never get confused, and it's just, and she uses it for great irony because all of her characters are stupid, and that's the whole point of it.
Anybody else on that?
I was waiting to speak because I'm struggling with figuring out what I wanted to say around that, but I'll just blurt out something anyway. So if there's no disadvantage to using close third, why do anything else, right? Why do an opaque third or a I guess that's called limited third, but or omniscience, or and I think about McCarthy again. I'm just thinking about that right now, I guess, because Michelle brought him up, and the distance that is placed between the reader and the characters in that, and why that's useful, and that's where I was kind of getting hung up. I wanted to kind of just bring that out there because I think I didn't put my thumb on exactly why that's useful, but I've done it. I've wanted to do that, and in some of it is that when you get too tied or too close into a character, it makes it hard then or it's less of a smooth transition into just the world you're writing about that might include many characters, right? In my latest novel, I think about because I've got a first person, like it's 80% of the things are first person narration, then there's like 20% that's third person, and I very purposefully, and this is why I almost hate the terms close third or omniscient third. It's all third, and it's just gradations of where you are along that, right? And I had to think about with that. I was thinking, okay, do I want access, when I'm in this third person voice, do I want access to how the characters are feeling, right? These are all just decisions you're making about distance. And I was like, well, so much of the first person is about how that character's feeling. I think tonally it's really important to not give myself access to that. I can see what the characters, and I decided, well, if the character, cuts himself, I can describe that hurts, but not the emotional feeling. So that was just random decisions.
What you're describing too is the pleasures of a more sort of cinematic approach. So
yes,
that it's less so that almost the thoughts of the characters would crowd you out of the feeling of simply being able to observe them, and then you jump in with maybe as a reader what they're thinking, and if you constantly get their thoughts. So there's that kind of pleasure with distance.
Yeah, and I think what I was struggling with is just like, what is that? What is that pleasure? Why do we want that? And some of it just has to do with it allows you to swoop out a little farther, to move to other characters, and not have it be jolting, right? It feels there's a consistency in that that maybe if you're like really in tight with a character and then you're popping to another character, you can do that, of course, but it has a less smooth kind of a cohesive feeling, maybe.
So one challenge, with third person, I thought how many of you have tackled books with multiple point of view, and then Greg talked about Flannery O'Connor, where suddenly the diction, and if you look at T.C. Boyle, he'll have multiple point of views, but the diction's creeping in each of the sections with the different characters, and that challenge. I mean, one thing, I had 4 point of view characters, and so I'd kept files on each of them, and some I'd be writing would come to me in a very, in a way that was vibrant during a day, and others would feel really distant from me for like a month, and then I'd figure out my way back into them. But anyway, some of the challenges with multiple characters with third person.
Well, every other book has been, no, not everyone. Well, anyway, a couple of books have been multiple points of view, and you try to write each one differently, and either you separate them by chapter or you separate them by a double space on the page, but you try to keep them separate, and they had to have different language and they had to think differently, because I was in close third for all of them. And what I found really helped me when I got through a draft was to go back and read all of this character's sections together, back to back, and then read all of this character's sections back to back, rather than going back and forth, because you get, oh, who says this? Who uses this word? So it has really helped me to keep them separate that way. So.
Anybody else?
I would only add that sometimes, in my experience, reading and writing stuff, the viewpoint switches can become kind of like a structural armature, so that, if you're going to be going, it's like a poetic form where it's A, B, A, B, A, B, C, B, or something like that. So you're going to flip from this point of view to the other one back and forth. And, in my experience, I might not even know how those perspectives are going to come together in the end till I get there. But that is helpful because it gives you something to hang on to while you're writing it. You're going to switch point of view, and you're going to go. You kind of set up the rules for the reader, the rules for yourself, and that gives you a little bit of structure to hang on to while you're writing. What was Eden Lepucki's novel that had all those switching viewpoints? California, maybe, yeah. Like that one, she's really playing with you in terms of like what you know and what you don't know, and
Stephen
it's a
Colbert's
fun
favorite
game.
novel.
Oh, yeah, it's good. It's a great read. It's really fun. And it's fun because of the way it flips around. It's called California. Is that right? Yeah. I forget. It's a forgettable title, I guess, but it's a great book.
So I spoke to Samir, who's often attended here, wonderful writer, and he was talking about a book that I'd recommended, and he loved it for just detailed characterization, just how rich the characters were. And he said, and then he just slipped. He doesn't really mean this, but he thought that right now all that's being published is voice, and that people have sort of gotten away from the hard work of characterization. I remember Charles Baxter wrote an essay for The Believers saying there are no physical descriptions of faces anymore because people don't want to do the work, of it. So, and I wonder if it seems within what we're talking about in the third person that all those little things in craft because like Josh, I mean, I agree with you. Like certain things, it's just another voice, and the voice that comes to me is not a writer actually who's writing. It's my character. But I wonder if some of those that work, the things that you're looking in workshop, the craft comes through more in third person. Is that possible?
I mean, well, anything's possible in language. I mean, language is the most plastic medium imaginable. But I mean, it just depends who's writing it. I mean, are we talking about incompetent writing or bad writing, or are we talking about really good writing?
Samir, I think he was implying that people are falling in love with books that aren't very good simply because.
I think that's true.
And a lot of them are first-person books that are not very good and not really thought out. But they're seductive because the voice sounds really different. So.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it was interesting to hear Diana say that YA and romance are a lot in first person, which
I love first person, by the way, but I'm on running the third person panel. So
I mean, Diary of a Rapist by Evan S. Connell is horrifying first person, but I don't think you can. But in first person, I don't think you can. I don't think you're precluded from seeing the narrator's face. I mean, you just have somebody come and say, "You got to stop using that exfoliant. You're bright red." I mean, I just don't think. I mean, yeah.
I think
looking in a mirror is a little. I was trying to be a little more original.
I think the danger that you're talking about, though, of can you essentially get away with less careful and honed craft in other aspects because the voice of the character in first person takes over and is alluring and and the people fall in love with that.
I'm not sure I even agree with that.
No, totally. Yeah, totally.
I would be on the panel saying, "No way, Barbash."
I just think the same thing applies to third, right? You can fall in love with the writer's voice and narration in third, and that can be very compelling and draw you through and cause you to kind of like gloss over some flaws maybe or lesser aspects of craft that are in there. So I think it's equally dangerous. Yeah.
This is not an answer to your question, but since you mentioned Samir, I just want to put in a plug for that other book of his, Our Beautiful Boys. I don't know if that's the one you're talking about. Yeah, but that in particular, that book, it does such cool things with point of view. Hiding the information. Typically you don't want to withhold information, and I guess from talking to him, he didn't actually know the answer, but there is a mystery that begins pretty early on in the book, and you don't find out until the last page. And the way he's playing that shell game with you has a lot to do with whose viewpoint he's in, and he's in all of them really, really plausibly. And right, you've read it. I'm assuming. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, he's. So, and then you go back and read it a second time and you realize how much he was doing all this kind of like interstitial stuff so that once you know the answer, you realize, of course, that's the answer. It's really cool.
I guess I don't know how Samir is defining voice, because if I read you a passage from Faulkner, you would immediately, without telling you it's Faulkner, you would immediately know it's Faulkner. Or Hemingway. That's voice, and it's an intelligence in the selection of the language. It's a cadence. That to me is voice, and I'm not going to throw that out. So I don't know how voice is being used here, other than what it sounds like a country and western song or something. It's a hokey voice or something. I don't know, or it's trite. But voice traditionally in literature is a kind of. There's something that's always there in that writer's writing, right? It's not narration, it's not dialogue, it's just the way they choose language and the cadence of the language, right?
Right.
I'll just share this little nugget of truth that came from Richard Ford, which was preceded by some really insulting comments. But then, he said, voice is the music of the intelligence behind the words. And I was like, damn, well, yeah, I'm not going to disagree with that.
Can you tell me, or each of you describe some moment where you're in the process of writing a book that you had sort of a crisis in terms of point of view, in terms of whatever it was wasn't working, and then you shifted, you made some sort of shift or realization that had to do with perspective that made it all come together in a way, or it started to write more easily as a result of some decision that you made with regard to how much, whether it's close or distant, or what within since it's third person, within a third person project.
When I was at the workshop table 1,000 years ago with Oakley Hall, I was writing Even Now in a pretty close and POV Oakley, claustrophobic first person. And he said, go write it in third person. And so I came back with more pages from Even Now, and he was just laughing at the end of the table. And he said, God damn, this is the closest third person I have ever read in my life. And I continue to write in a pretty close third person, so close that people think it's first person, but I don't know. That's not valuable to anybody else to hear, but it was an attempt to get me away from a kind of very careful perception in the writing, I think. Yeah.
My third book, Bump, I wrote, it starts with a car accident, and it's from 4 points of view, the people that are all involved in this car accident. The guy driving, the guy who loses his car that he sleeps in, and the woman who runs the red light, and then the cop who comes to the scene. And they were all in close third. And I struggled and struggled and struggled. And then I made the cop, who was not really the main character, but I made him in first person, and it sort of opened him up to me. And so I have 3 voices in third person and 1 voice in first person, and they just are who they are. No matter what Michelle says, I'm not very technical. I just kind of go, oh, that's how I hear it. That's how I hear it. So, but it took a while. I tried to do third very hard.
I'm just going to defend myself. I said I don't start out saying I'm going to write something in third person. I could care less. Yeah. What you were discovering was how to write the character, right? And you weren't putting any boundaries up or rules. You just, when you found, oh, this has to be in first person, you didn't stop yourself. Yeah.
I've had the challenge, when I wrote a book in multiple third of who, I'll have a moment where all the characters are there. Who gets to tell that story? So, and which character and then I would do it, and it wasn't as interesting, and then I did it through another character, through the cop's point of view, as you will. But you find that person, then all of a sudden that was exactly, because you'll find, a few students I remember asked me, wouldn't it be great to have everybody's point of view, during it, like just access to everyone? And it's precisely when you don't have access to point of view, they become a wild card, and that's where all the tension comes. So you have to find out when don't I want that character's thoughts. So, so that I don't know if you've all had that kind of experience. So
when you asked the question, I was I was going back through the files, trying to think of when that had happened, and I was drawing a blank, but then I remembered way earlier on when I was writing Fiddler's Dream, it started in first person, and I forgot that it did. And I mean, it was just 8 pages or something, just kind of threw it away. And I guess I ran into a dead end pretty fast and ditched it. But then when I went back into the scene in third person, then it was fine. And I guess, it's what I said before, is I personally had kind of run out of ways to make first person work for me. And I don't want to make it sound like I don't like first person. When I teach, do a class on point of view, and we'll spend six out of 10 classes talking about first person, because I think it's harder and more complicated, and there are more things about it. So we'll talk about the retrospective first person, which is practically omniscient at times. And we'll talk about the subjective first person, where you really can't see around the main character and you can't know any more than they do, like Dennis Johnson or someone like that. Jane Smiley's novel, The Age of Greed, novella, you cannot see around that guy until you get to the very end of it. You don't know what's true. And then you've got the unreliable first, where you obviously have someone who doesn't see things correctly, and there's distortion in the lens. But as the reader, you can see exactly what this guy's not seeing. And then all the gradations in between that. And yeah, I mean, we'll spend tons of time on that, and then we'll get to third, and just like, here's third, and here's omniscience, and basically, like, I don't know, it kind of explains itself.
I like Unreliable Third. I'm thinking about, I really love the book Revolutionary Road, which is, you have the unreliable third, which are these self-deceiving characters, and then the real voice of the novel is the given son who gets let out of a mental institution and goes to the barbecue and says, you guys aren't going to Europe. And just like he says these very true things that breaks through this very close, claustrophobic third. So that's, it's something that where third is acting like first. Josh, did you have anything to say?
I was thinking, going back through the files, and just trying to think about when that had happened, and maybe at least relatedly, one is a short story where, my natural inclination is to try to write a closer third. I want to be in close with the characters, and I realized that for the short story to work, I needed to kind of traverse the character's entire life. And so just for the limitations of that, of how much space I had, it forced me into a more distant third, so I could move more kind of quickly and at a different level. And so it was a decision about, like, where does the power in this story lie? Like, the power in that story lay in the long scope of the life and the movement of that person over that of that long scope. And obviously you could do it in snippets of very close third or something like that, but it was that kind of a decision that then that allowed the story to happen in the way I was imagining it, I guess.
That made me think of Tobias Wolff's Bullet in the Brain, when we're with Anders, right, and he's in the bank, and then but all of a sudden, because it's in third and the bullet's going through the brain, we can get the whole life. You can jump. But that's, I guess, what I'd want before we bring in all of you is to say that I think there's some people that may think that there's magic in first person and there's magic in third, and there's with that Flannery, the Flaubert example, that's an idea of what it can do, going into the dogs, going into a person's whole life as a bullet is passing through the brain. And what all these writers are talking about is that's what you're looking for, and there are ways of getting there through all different perspectives, and each story is going to demand a particular point of view. But maybe we can open it up to you in the audience. What kind of questions? Yeah. I'm going to call on one of you if you don't jump.
I'm just going to say something. Eric, I don't know that this answers the question or not, but the minute you name a character, you're looking at the character, right? You're on the outside of the character. When you move into pronouns, you're getting closer and closer into that character. You have this is Henry James. You have a character walk to the window and look out. You're on the inside of that character's head because you want to know what that character sees. Right, so I would almost say that third person is always varying a little the vantage, and I don't exactly know what you mean by Cervantes being there. I mean, with
he's identifying, but he's not
right.
Totally consumed by Don Quixote, and he has
right.
the ability to do other things.
Right.
Do you know that passage in The Art of Fiction that Gardner has on psychic distance? Do you know this little thing? So he has different things. So he says like it was a year 104, year 1904, and a man steps out of the building. And the next one is Henry Warburton stepped out of the building. And then the next one is the snow was inside his collar. Like it shows it's more and more intimacy. It's all third person, but and then he talks about control of psychic distance, that you can't do these, like you could begin at that distance and then pull in close. But that I just thought of that with that question. Dana, you had a question.
Yeah, I was hoping that Al could talk a little more about one of my favorite kinds of short stories, which are the ones that are more sort of like repertoire. They're just something like the classic those like White Elephant or Carver story, or
Why I Live at the P&O.
yeah, something where it's just like the dialogue and the gestures do everything.
Mhm.
There's no interiority, no closeness whatsoever. Those stories can be some of the most satisfying stories. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that.
No, I agree. I mean, Dana, I said it and that was sort of what I was saying with Josh. I mean, for me, and those are the first stories I fell in love with and made me want to write. For me, it's I do this chart that Frank Conroy used to do between the reader and the writer, and that you want to go in the middle. If it's too far towards the writer, it's too cryptic. If it's the other side, everything's spelled out. And you want an active reader. And so when we look at that, we're making observations. We're working, and then it's so fun and so great. And the idea of restricting yourself. Yeah, I think it's a really it's a terrific way to both work and I love those stories. I agree.
Yeah, I just kind of thank you for that. It kind of clarified some thoughts for me, and maybe in relationship to what Eric was saying too, because you mentioned power in that, and I was thinking about the power that the writer has, and there's something that is exciting about reading a story where the writer has relinquished some power, and I think in those instances, the writer's giving power to the reader, right, to step in and play a role. A similar thing can happen with first person, I think, where the writer in some ways relinquishes some power, because that first person is also driven by a voice that is not the writer's presence, right, in the same way. And I think there's a certain, in my mind, there's a link there that can be exciting for a reader in seeing this first person feels like there's an engagement with the reader, with the writer is kind of removed, and in the same way with the witnessing these kinds of stories where you're having to step in and fill in the emotion and stuff like that. There's an engagement with the writer removed a little bit.
Carver is like the perfect example of that. It's kind of hard to think of anyone who does it more effectively or more consistently. I really like William Trevor. Different approach to the same kind of thing, where you feel as if, the story stands on its own. I don't know if people read William Trevor currently, but I think he's just like so skillful at showing you these people doing things and then closing the story, and you know exactly what it was about. But he's never kind of tipped his hand at all. It's crazy good.
The News from Ireland by William Trevor. Yeah, I'm sorry. Were you going to mention that? No. But also the story that Tom Barbash brought up, Greatness Strikes Where It Pleases, is a Down syndrome probably boy. You don't have access to his brain. He's in a kind of forest in a wood, and there's mushrooms, and he kind of starts to understand his own kind of emerging erection probably through the mushroom. And it is an amazing story, and I wish I could read it in its original language, but it's completely from the outside. So yeah, and the News from Ireland by Trevor, everybody should read Trevor. It's two different points of view, by the way. You go back and forth between the butler, right, and then I think it's a more distant point of view from one of the absentee landlords, right? Yeah.
There's this sort of I'll find the name of it, Dana, and send it to you. But there's an A.L. Kennedy story, and in it, it's a couple, and it begins. I was just talking about this. They're definitely going to break up. Every feeling of it is bleak. Feels like Hills Like White Elephants, and then there's this slight shift at some point, and the chemistry gets subtly better. And by the end of the story, a few things happen, and you realize they're going to be together forever. And she read it. It was at the Edinburgh Festival, and it was read, and everybody gasped, at the end. And it was so and it was the distance, I think, that created the intimacy. Ultimately, it made us so a part of it. And it's amazing. So, yeah. I'll find it and I can send it to Brett. Yeah. But it's amazing. It's really great. Yeah. So, yeah. One more question. Are you a professor? No, just great question.
I definitely think humor operates differently in first and third. And it's interesting we're talking about the writer relinquishing control, but I think you almost have to have more control with humor. It can't be sloppy. It won't be funny. It has to be so true to that character. And I don't know if I could be funny in third person. I don't know if I could. I did not try. It never occurred to me. 'Cause it's so from her and her unreliable observations about herself and everybody around her. So, thanks.
Anybody else on the subject of humor in first and third?
I would just say if you can be funny in either one, if you can be funny, period, you can get away with everything you want to do.
Yeah, and I do think, I think funny people tend to be funny in first and third. What a great audience, and thank you for sharing your hot afternoon with us.